Order. I call Cat Smith to move the motion.
Mr. Vickers, and I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 648577 relating to a visa scheme for Palestinians. I wish to thank the hard work of all the individuals and organisations who supported the petition in achieving the threshold for this debate, particularly Gaza Families Reunited, who I had the privilege of meeting in the run-up to this debate, for whom many of those involved in supporting this petition, this is an issue that impacts their loved ones. Gaza Families Reunited is made up of 350 Palestinians living in the UK with family in Gaza, and they are calling on the UK government to establish a Gaza family scheme to enable Palestinians in the UK to bring their loved ones to safety from Gaza until it is safe to return. They note that the government has previously introduced successful bespoke pathways for those fleeing persecution in Ukraine and Hong Kong, and argue that the same can and indeed must be done for Palestinians from Gaza. They point to the Ukraine family scheme as a model on which the Gaza family scheme could be modelled. Since October 7th, which saw 1,143 murdered by Hamas and around 3,500 injured, with 252 hostages taken, of whom 128 remain unaccounted for, we have all seen the devastating humanitarian consequences of all caught up in this conflict. And it's impossible to understand the pain felt by those waiting to hear the fate of their loved ones taken hostage, or the grief of families mourning 34,000 killed in Gaza. We hear terrible statistics so frequently that they begin to lose their meaning. However, each of those numbers are people. People who have or had loved ones, hopes, dreams, and whose lives have been irrevocably altered by this conflict. I'd like to thank Noah Katz, who chairs Lancaster and the Lakes Jewish community in my constituency, for their time sharing how we can advocate for peace rather than stoking the division, our common views on the need to see hostages released and a ceasefire, and that although the Jewish community in Lancaster is small, it has strong links with friends and family in Israel. In the 7 months since October 7th, they have provided support for local Jewish families. The local Jewish community has adopted the Bibas family as part of the Board of Deputies' Seder Seat for a Hostage campaign, and I thank Noah for the way in which they support the Jewish families in Lancaster, including my own. Absolutely.
I thank my honourable friend for taking an intervention, and would she agree with me that between the synagogues, mosques, churches in our own communities, we see an incredible extension of the concept of community and heart coming through from our faith communities and our different school groups and others who really promote a togetherness and trying to approach different problems from a real community point of view.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and indeed when we look at faith groups and indeed the philosophies behind every major world religion, it is that of peace and love. To date, 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, of whom a significant majority are civilians. Over 77,000 Gazans have been injured, or over 75% of the population of Gaza. 1.6 million people have been displaced, often more than once. I give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way and for the excellent speech that you are making. The Foreign Secretary has called the scale and suffering in Gaza unimaginable, yet the Conservative government are content with sitting on their hands watching the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left in Rafah suffer and wait to be killed without offering any refugees. So does my honourable friend agree that our constituents expect compassion from their government? And a vital part of this compassion is having a family visa scheme for those trapped in Gaza with family members in the UK.
And I hope that this debate will provide the opportunity to express that compassion. I believe that members of this House do feel on this matter, and I know the Minister is in his place and he's listening. In my conversations with Gaza Families Reunited, I heard about one family in particular who've been displaced 5 times, each time a terrifying experience. Aid is still not reaching Gaza in sufficient quantities, and the humanitarian crisis is worsening daily. The UN World Food Programme says that due to food shortages, Gaza is entering full-blown famine. This will only be made worse by the beginning of the invasion in Rafah, the same place Israel encouraged Gazans to move in order to be in relative safety. Hundreds of thousands of Gazans are yet again being displaced and are being forced to leave the only route out of Gaza. I give way.
Congratulations on securing this incredibly important debate. There are reports that almost half of the agricultural land in Gaza has been destroyed, and this morning it said the health system across Gaza could collapse within a few hours. Would you agree with me this is just only adds to the urgency of this government doing all it can to provide safety for those fleeing this horrific conflict?
I would absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and indeed food security is something that deeply concerns me. I see my honourable friend trying to catch my eye there as well.
I'm extremely grateful and congratulate you on securing this debate and making a very powerful speech. I, like many people I'm sure in this room, was very proud to be able to intervene in support of Ukrainian refugees who were being accommodated by friends and family in this country. Having a large Afghan community, many people were disappointed at not having a similar treatment. Once again, many people who have families and friends in the Palestinian community feel that there should be some degree of parity of treatment for people based on need rather than where the conflict originated.
All I can do is agree with my honourable friend and say that indeed my experience from my own constituents is that they were only too willing to be hospitable when it came to us taking Ukrainian refugees, and indeed there is that great culture I believe that we have about compassion and caring for our neighbour when they're in trouble.
Would my honourable friend get to work?
I'm going to go to my right first and then over that direction.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. She's been very, very generous. On that point of family visa schemes, when I wrote to the Minister asking if there was a possibility of family visas, he wrote back to say our approach must be considered in the round rather than on a crisis by crisis basis. Does my honourable friend think this is a fairly novel approach? When there was the crisis in Afghanistan, in Ukraine and in Hong Kong, schemes, whatever their merits, were set up to deal with that individual crisis. Why can't that be applied now?
I don't know if my friend's been looking ahead, but I'm going to come to this. But yes, I do agree that we can't really go from a crisis-by-crisis approach. And actually, there is a huge problem for many people fleeing conflict all over the world. And the lack of safe routes that we have is something that's come up in the conversations I've had in meetings ahead of this debate with organisations like the Refugee Council. I'm conscious I've taken a lot of interventions from my own party, and I saw two colleagues over there from the other party. So if I start with my colleague from the SNP and then the Green Party.
Very grateful to the Chair of the Petitions Committee for opening the debate and framing it the way she has. She's right to touch on the situation not just in Rafah but in Gaza. Given that the Foreign Secretary is on record well in the past referring to Gaza as an open-air prison and with things projected only to get worse in Rafah, isn't it the case that many of us can only conclude that for the view of the UK government, a Palestinian life is actually worth less than that of another nationality?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention and agree with his assessment of the situation, and indeed quite a lot of what the Foreign Secretary has said in the past would do well to influence current government policy, I would suspect, and my colleague from the Green Party.
She's been very generous. I thank her for giving way and congratulate her on her introduction so far. Would she agree with me that the current system just simply isn't working because the requirement to enrol biometrics at a visa application centre is simply impossible to meet? The one in Gaza is closed. You can't get to Ramallah or Jerusalem. In effect, people are caught in this really sickening Orwellian catch-22 where they cannot enrol their biometrics because they can't leave Gaza, and they can't leave Gaza because they can't enrol their biometrics. This is a sickening situation to leave people in. Does she agree that that is yet more evidence of the need for this bespoke family reunion scheme, just as was done, as she has said, in Ukraine and Hong Kong as well?
I very much agree, and in a few moments' time, if I can make some progress with my speech, the Honourable Lady will find that that is exactly the point that I'm going to make, and I'm going to give one final time before I make some progress.
I'm really grateful. On that point, the Home Office say that they can offer deferral of biometrics in some family reunion cases, but sadly for many families who are waiting for those decisions, it becomes too late because they die in Gaza just waiting for the decision. I'm hoping that the Minister today will tell us what he's doing to rapidly speed up this process and remove unnecessary barriers so family members can get to safety.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and once again, I find myself in agreement. I will make a little bit more progress, Mr Vickers, with my speech, not try your patience too much. The government position outlined in their response to the petition in December is that the UK recognises that there are people impacted by the war who may wish to join family in the UK. However, the government is not making plans to create a bespoke pathway for Palestinians, but continues to prioritise immediate family reunification for British citizens and for people with pre-existing right to live in the UK for over 6 months. Whilst the government states that Palestinians can come to the UK through existing immigration routes, the petitioners wished that I draw particular attention to the lack of safe routes out of Gaza for Palestinians and indeed for anyone in a conflict zone. For their application to even be considered by the Home Office, people must attend visa application centres to give their biometric data, but there is no VAC in Gaza. That's closed, and they can't get through to Jerusalem or Ramallah. And until recently, of course, they could pay thousands of US dollars to get out by a private company to Egypt over the Rafah border, but that's now impossible because of the situation at the Rafah border. That is another option closed off, and Gazans are now effectively trapped with no way of giving their biometrics. There is an option to apply for a deferred biometric enrolment, but since the start of the conflict in October, I understand that every single request for deferral in Palestine has been refused by the Home Office. People living in the UK who have families in Gaza that they have not managed to get out can do nothing but watch their families suffer daily. As one petitioner, Ghassan, who I met last week, said, his family has been displaced and evacuated within Gaza many times before he managed to get them across the border to Egypt. And he said, there is no safe place in Gaza, and that is the tragic reality that's happening on the ground today. But, yes.
Grateful, and she's very generous with her time. And hearing about the people that she was just talking about, if I could just raise the case of my constituent Emily Fairs, who has multiple family members. They were in Rafah. Half of them have now disappeared because they were afraid in anticipation of the likely Israeli military campaign there. And what she tells me is that these are people who have degrees, who have skills, who could offer so much here if only the door was not so resolutely closed against them. Yeah. And it just begs the question, how is the humanitarian question being answered here in the UK, and why are we refusing the skills of these people?
Yeah.
Well, I hope the Minister has heard the Honourable Lady's intervention, and I'm hoping that he might respond to some of these points in his remarks. For those who are able to get out of Gaza and into Egypt, their future's uncertain. Palestinians have no status in Egypt, so students, teachers, small business owners, etc. are left in limbo, out of immediate danger but unable to start rebuilding their lives. It seems clear to me that events in recent years in Ukraine, Gaza, Afghanistan and beyond means that as a country we need to look again at how we support and protect those fleeing conflict. At present, there appears to be a grim lottery when it comes to who we are prepared to do everything we can to help. The immediate priority, however, must be Gaza, given the devastation of the conflict and the lack of support being provided to Palestinians in surrounding countries. As with Hong Kong and Ukraine, we can see a very clear need for a visa scheme for Palestinians. The petitioners are asking a very basic question. Why should people living in the UK not be able to apply to sponsor their family members to keep them safe whilst this conflict is ongoing? If we were able to implement a visa scheme for the people of Ukraine, why can we not implement a similar visa scheme for the people living in Gaza? Of course, I'm just going to make a bit of progress. Of course, there must be a right of return attached to any scheme, and sadly the history of the region has all too often been one of dispossession and loss, and it is essential that any Palestinian leaving Gaza is able to return to rebuild their lives there as soon as they feel able to do so. There is a very real feeling amongst Palestinians I've spoken to that those who have watched in horror the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, that Palestinian lives somehow do not matter as much as those caught up in other conflicts. I hope the Minister today will disabuse this notion, certainly as far as the government is concerned, by responding positively to this petition. Now, I can see that Westminster Hall is very full, Mr Vickers, and I know many colleagues are hoping to speak today, so I am going to draw my remarks to a close to allow as many as possible to participate as fully as possible. Thanks.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called during the debate. We'll be setting no formal time limit, but as you can see, the debate is very heavily subscribed, so if members could restrict their comments to about 6 or 7 minutes. The mover of the motion has been very generous with her interventions, but I would say that if we can limit them, that would help the country. Absana Begum. Oh, sorry, I've got to read out this first. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 648-577 relating to a visa scheme for Palestinians. Absana Begum.
The plight of Palestinian refugees remains the longest unresolved refugee crisis in the world. That's according to the United Nations. And this was the situation even before the current war on the civilians of Gaza. As per the signatories of the petition today, including a large number of my own constituents, the strong feeling in our communities is evident and it is clear. In Gaza, we are witnessing collective punishment, destruction and displacement of human lives on a horrific and unprecedented scale. Ongoing indiscriminate bombing has turned a chronic humanitarian crisis into a catastrophe. And for those who do survive, there is an imminent risk of death by disease and starvation. Millions are displaced, but where are they to go? Because as I speak, there is simply no safe space left for those fleeing from Rafah. It would be helpful if the Minister today updates us as to where he thinks people are to flee to. Previously, many of us have called for safe routes when Russia invaded Ukraine and some visa schemes were set up for Ukrainians. And so how can it be that there are no safe routes for Palestinians to reach sanctuary in the UK, even if they have family here? In fact, I'll give way very quickly.
I thank the honourable member for giving me. She's making a very powerful point. Has she, like me, been touched by the fact that the many constituents who've written to me about this ask that very question? How can it be that we have a scheme for the Ukrainians, but not one for Palestinians? That concerns them, and they need to hear from the government why that's the case.
I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I do hope that the Minister addresses this point in his response. So how can it be that there are no safe routes for Palestinians to reach sanctuary in the UK, even if they have family here? In fact, humanitarian visa routes are rarely available to Palestinians in any form, despite 1 in 6 of the world's refugees being Palestinian. I've spoken in this House repeatedly, asking why Palestinians are all too often treated differently. The dehumanisation, the devaluation of Palestinian life has been so stark and, to be totally frank, utterly appalling. History teaches us that a people are dehumanised so that they can be killed, displaced and starved with impunity, and indeed so that they can be denied assistance and asylum when they are so clearly in need. I know that many of my constituents have been utterly shocked at the racism, the Islamophobia and the double standards. Something has been fundamentally broken or revealed, however you look at it. And I will give way.
The Honourable Lady. I wonder if she would agree with me that, like my constituents, feel very similar to her, but actually we have rehoused a number of people from Gaza who came as family members of British Gazans when the war broke out. And what I have seen from my constituency is the open-hearted nature to help those families, that any concern about what is actually a relatively small group of people that this visa scheme would apply to, about their not being resourced. And in fact, all of the Gazans that we resettled into Birmingham Yardley were actually doctors and are bringing huge amounts of resource, and that actually our communities, even in the face of the racism she talks about, are ready with open arms to help.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I agree with her. We are a place of sanctuary and we welcome refugees. The political establishment has totally been out of touch with the majority of British people on this, and I think this will not be easily forgotten. Young people across East London ask me, how is it that the government condemns certain countries for their human rights records and crimes but not others? Why is it that it seems that the right to self-determination is spoken about for some and not others? Why are some national flags celebrated and others denigrated, even effectively banned? Why are some deaths mourned and others explained away? Why is it that for the government, too many Palestinians have been killed or that too many are starving, but there is no condemnation of who killed them or who is starving them? I, as many across the UK and around the world, have always been opposed to the bombing and displacement of civilians, but this government has supported it in Gaza. What did they think would happen when they supported the openly declared intent to reduce the entire Gaza Strip to rubble? Whenever this government have been asked about what the long-term plan was for millions of civilians in Gaza, they have been unable to answer. Instead, it was this government who withdrew funding from UNRWA shortly after the ICJ's interim ruling. It is this government that helps ensure Israel have the weapons to kill women and children. Indeed, it would be helpful if the Minister updates us today as to the latest assessment as to whether weapons from the UK have been used to kill children. Whenever asked about how UK trade weapons are used, the government provides pro forma general lines about ongoing reviews and the licensing criteria. If these reviews are actually happening, why can we not know what they actually reveal? Especially now when those living the reality of this horror are reaching out for support to survive, it is this government who turns their back on humanity. Now, for some time now, parliamentary political discourse uses migration, even the absolute horror of people dying in the English Channel, cynically as a political tool. It is the age-old phenomena of scaremongering and scapegoating. And as the government erodes our civil liberties and democratic rights, as they disenfranchise and disempower, as they attack the very fabric of our communities through austerity, they foster fear and division and falsely point to migrants for the cause of our alienation. But the truth is that it is overwhelmingly clear that the global drivers of refugee movements are intrinsically connected to the legacies of colonialism and empire, which live on to this day. There is no doubt that the British government has a responsibility to step up for the people of Gaza fleeing the collective punishment, and yet, shamefully, there is no doubt that they are still choosing complicity rather than compassion.
Thank you, Chair, and also thank you to the member for Lancaster and Fleetwood for taking this on today. I think it's incredibly important for a number of reasons to consider Palestinian individuals affected by the war to be allowed into the UK, just as we've done for Ukraine, because currently there isn't any bespoke visa scheme for Palestinians able to come to the UK in much the way that there had been for Ukraine. I will keep my remarks fairly short, and first of all, touching upon the international community aspect. As we saw on Friday past, 143 countries at the United Nations General Assembly voted to recognise Palestine as a state. I think that Palestine has to be recognised as a state as soon as possible. I believe strongly in the two-state solution. Then and only then can you have the recognition to have the building blocks that it joins the international community as a fully paid-up member also. Aside from the international community aspect, I also want to just go back to two of the previous speakers in the debate who had mentioned that perhaps there was favouritism shown for some communities and not for others. And I hope very much so that that isn't the case. And I can only speak on behalf of my constituents in Bolton North East. I know today, for example, in the audience, I count almost a third to perhaps half of the audience members have a link to Bolton in some shape or form. This is an issue that's incredibly important for my constituents. We saw it on Saturday when I was with the Right Honourable Member opposite for Bolton South East when we attended a rally at Bolton Town Hall in support of the cause of the Palestinian people and the Gazan people in particular. So my constituents do care about this. They care very much, and they believe that Palestinian lives are as important as anyone else's lives. And I think we have in Bolton a place of fantastic diversity. We have incredibly good form when it comes to welcoming people from all across the world. I'm very proud to have a Muslim community in Bolton that numbers almost 20%, mostly from Gujarati Indian backgrounds, but also Pakistani British and other countries indeed. And we just saw again, it seems like we're working as a team, looking at my fellow friend in the constituency beside me in Bolton South East. We attended the opening of a new medical centre in Bolton, which was founded by Afghan British national, that shows the impact that people can have from across the world on modern-day British society. And we shouldn't see people as just a burden. We should actually see people as an opportunity. I will indeed give way to the Honourable Member.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I have to say, Orkney and Shetland do not boast the same range of ethnic diversity as Bolton, but I have been quite overwhelmed by the number of emails I have received on this. And I think the lesson that we have to take from that is that British people as a whole, whatever ethnic background or heritage they may have, see people in harm's way and want to help them. And that is why there is the scale of support that there is for a visa scheme of this sort.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland. And if I may say, you know, if there was a scheme to come out at some point in the future to welcome Palestinians, there may be a challenge between the member and my good self to house a Palestinian in our household. I would be very, very happy to do so if such a programme existed. I think, thirdly, I would just like to perhaps ask the Minister, of course with my Parliamentary Private Secretary hat on, I stand with Government on all policy issues, but more a question from my constituents is asking, have other alternatives been considered within the Home Office, one that's a scheme that's identical to that Ukraine, but perhaps other schemes that perhaps his civil servants are currently looking at, which could help the people of Gaza. Because at the end of the day, when you're looking at a place, the Gaza Strip, which has 1.82 million people, roughly the same population as my home region of Northern Ireland. You have Rafah, an area where those who have fled to Rafah, which pretty much maps onto the same area as Heathrow Airport and what's been referred to as a city of children. I think that action does need to be taken. I think that as a country and a people that we can do more for the people of Gaza and for the people of Palestine in this time of need. I will absolutely. Thank you.
Giving way. As is mentioned, he supports the policies of the government. Would he then ask the government to ensure that this scheme is carried away straight away, that the centres provide locally support for the people who want to enter, that they're not able to, as it's been said, read biometric offices and to be able to register. So there should be facilities by additional staff at the Egypt border to be able to facilitate those people. And above all, does he agree that there should be an urgent ceasefire for this scheme to take place properly and to be adhered to?
Thank you so much to the Honourable Member from Birmingham. And I agree with much of what you've said. Actually, if we look at those in Gaza at the moment trying to get to the United Kingdom or indeed other countries, if going via Egypt, the sheer cost of having to do that can be considerable. And I hope that that's something, again, as a government that we're looking into as a way to alleviate the pressure on those who may be applying. We did have a case, actually, in my constituency office, and we worked very closely with another MP in Greater Manchester, where a very young child, a toddler, have been very unwell, and when the outbreak of war happened, they weren't able to come to the UK, and we've only just very recently found out that they have been repatriated to the UK. So I do agree wholly, and actually for months now on end, on behalf of my constituents, we have been calling for an immediate ceasefire to happen, because this scheme itself that we're debating today, obviously it's a short-term fix, and the people of Palestine, ultimately the Gazans, want to be in their home, which is Gaza. They don't necessarily want to be in the UK long-term. It's a short-term fix, but we need to be looking at the long-term is peace in the Middle East, in Gaza, in particular in the two-state solution. I will.
I won't do too much more of this, but the specific case, I believe, I was also involved with some of, if it is the same case. In that case specifically, there is an issue with any family reunification, usually is grandparents, children, husbands, wives, but there are thousands, tens of thousands of orphans in Gaza currently who have no immediate family, who may very well be ill, who have aunties and uncles and cousins here in the UK. So any scheme that we design, I think, should ensure that it understands that actually in most people's immediate family in Gaza, certainly children, are all dead.
And indeed, it's very sad that we have to be here today and to look at what's happened over the last 7 months. Figures in a meeting was just held in Portcullis House was looking at 36,000 people, 100,000 people in total, including those who have been injured since the outbreak of this. And the trauma that will cause today, tomorrow, and well into the future is something that people will find incredibly difficult if ever to get off. And looking at our own case again in Northern Ireland, where 3,500 people died in the Troubles over the space of 30, 40 years, and this is compacted times 10 into the space of 7 months. It's deeply, deeply saddening. I think I will end on those notes, but just again to reiterate that there's so much that we can do as a country, and I think also as the international community, as we've seen on Friday past with 143 people getting behind Palestine and actually calling for that two-state solution, not to be just a slogan, but to be an action point.
Thank you.
Petition that has led to this debate, and I'm really grateful for the continued efforts and support to raise awareness of this devastating situation. Over 34,000 Palestinians have now been killed since the 7th of October. Sadly, this includes 14,500 children. Over 78,000 are injured. More than 8,000 are missing, presumably dead under the rubble. A catastrophic humanitarian crisis unfolds. There are people at risk of serious harm, including from indiscriminate violence and armed conflict. Can they claim asylum in the UK? No, because they must be physically present to do so. The government highlights the availability of safe and legal routes to get here, namely refugee resettlement programmes, refugee family reunion visas and nationality-specific humanitarian visa schemes. However, there seems to be a reluctance to recognise these are very rarely available to Palestinians, as they are currently ineligible for refugee resettlement in the UK. A refugee family reunion visa depends on their having a sponsor already granted asylum. This is a very emotional subject for me, Chair, because every day on the television I see people starving. No water, no food, no medicine, and it seems no one actually cares. Mainstream visa options are also often insufficient. Palestinians with immediate family in the UK can apply for a standard family visa, but this requires family ties in the UK, which many don't have, and my honourable member for Yarwood, Birmingham, raised the issue of children who have lost their families and have nobody to look after them, sponsor them or get them here. Sponsored work or study visas are not designed for humanitarian purposes, and the associated cost and practical requirements are often prohibitive. Furthermore, visitor visas are often refused by the Home Office, who we know are less likely to accept visitors who may claim asylum in the UK, despite the devastation that's happened in Palestine. In 2023, the Home Office refused around 1 in 3 visitors' visa applications from Palestinians. With the visa application centre in Gaza also closed, people face great practical difficulty even lodging a visa application. Existing visa options are simply insufficient in this case, and the government knows this. We know that they know this because the government widened the scope of the visa regime for Ukrainian citizens and their family members, following criticism at the time that the current system was not working. It wasn't working and they fixed it. Members will recall the British citizens and permanent residents were able to sponsor a much wider range of family members for a visa than is generally permitted, and those sponsored could also bring their own immediate family. The requirements to attend a visa application centre were also waived, which would be good if that happened in Palestine. I'm aware of the government's response to the e-petition in December 2023, where it said there were no plans to introduce a special visa scheme for Palestinians. I'd asked the Minister why. I myself wrote to the Home Office in November seeking advice as to the government's plans to support refugees from Gaza, and specifically where his department intends to implement a scheme similar to that of the recent Homes for Ukraine. The calls for such a scheme have been growing for months, and as I said earlier, every day we see children dying, and we sit back and watch, and we really need to act urgently. The Lancashire Council of Mosque, which is based in my constituency, wrote to its members at the end of last year seeking views on its proposal to welcome orphaned Gazan children to Lancashire. And everybody knows Lancashire is a very welcoming place. We have caring and loving families who are willing to open their homes and hearts to these children. And I was heartened by the generosity of this offer, which is testament to the compassion and humanity of the Blackburn community. However, I received a disappointing response to my letter from the government in January to the same effect. There is no safe area in Gaza. A Rafah offensive must not go ahead, and the UK government must do everything in its power to make sure it does not happen. This includes immediately halting the sale of all weapons to Israel, helping with the delivery of aid, and only today on social media I saw settlers totally destroy a delivery of aid and laughing and cheering as they done it. It's sad, and it's sad as human beings we can stand back and watch that and not do enough to put a stop to it. We need to work towards securing an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And I asked the Minister, where does the government expect thousands of displaced Palestinians to go? Or does he actually care? Building upon the precedent set by the Home for Ukraine programme and other nationality-specific schemes that have been established previously, the UK government has an opportunity now to extend compassion and solidarity towards the people of Palestine, and I urge them to do it urgently.
Harry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't expecting to be called so early on. Thank you. Can I thank Gaza Families Reunited and all those who signed the petition, particularly my Edinburgh South West constituents. I want to preface my comments today by saying that I'm a supporter of the Balfour Project, which seeks to do three things. First of all, to acknowledge Britain's historic role in shaping 20th and 21st century Palestine and Israel, particularly in the light of the Balfour Declaration and the policies of the British Mandate. Secondly, to support Palestinians and Israelis in building a peaceful future based on equal rights, justice and security for all. And thirdly, to work for the British government's recognition of the State of Palestine. And while the British government recognised the State of Israel in 1950, Palestinians remain stateless, exiled, refugees or second-class citizens in their own land. And I saw that degree to which they are second-class citizens with my own eyes when I visited in 2016 with CABU and the charity Human Appeal, and I refer to my register of interests in that regard. The United Kingdom therefore bears a historic responsibility for what has happened to Palestinians since the Nakba, and this is something which should be at the forefront of the government's mind and at the forefront of the minister's mind when considering this request for a visa scheme for Palestinians. This visa scheme is urgent because of the terrible situation in which Palestinians in Gaza find themselves. And the United Kingdom has a historic as well as a contemporary moral responsibility to help out. Now, many of my constituents in Edinburgh South West are acutely aware of this and have contacted me asking me to support this petition, as well as to support a ceasefire and supporting the immediate cessation of any arms being sent from the United Kingdom that are being used against innocent men, women and children in Gaza. And some of my constituents have a particular interest as they are exiled Palestinians themselves, or they have family in jeopardy as a result of the situation in Gaza. I will give way, yes.
Lady, for giving way. I too have had numerous constituents contact me, urging me to urge the government to set up this sort of visa scheme, including Lama, who has 3 elderly aunts sheltering in a church in Gaza, and Anwar, who's already lost numerous family members. And his parting words to me when I met him were, are our lives so cheap? And so I say to members here and the Minister, if we all agree that their lives are not so cheap, then why on earth does the government not set up a scheme on a par with the Ukrainian scheme? And importantly, there must be a right of return for those who do seek refuge here or elsewhere, given the displacement trauma so many generations of Palestinians have suffered.
Joanna Cherry.
The Honourable Lady has said, and particularly that last point she made about the right of return. But the right of return must not be cynically used by the government to justify not having a scheme. And when constituents come to see me, as they do regularly at my surgery, to talk about the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, particularly constituents with a connection, I am ashamed, Chair, I am ashamed that the British government has not done more to help, has done so very little to help, and is not honouring its historic and moral obligations here. Now, I want to talk about one constituent in particular. Her name is Dr. Eman El-Banasawi, and she's a specialist dentist who managed to evacuate her 79-year-old mother from Gaza to Cairo at huge expense, as other honourable members will know. Now, this old lady witnessed the Nakba as a child, and she has endured all the recent wars on Gaza. She's in very poor health, and she's already been displaced 9 times during the current war, and her home has been destroyed by the bombing, so she's got nowhere to go back to. Her daughter and her daughter's family, and I know my honourable friend, the member for Glenrothes, has a relative of my constituents in his constituency. They are in a position to support their mother, but they face huge logistical difficulties in getting here. And they look at the scheme that was afforded to Ukrainian refugees, and they cannot understand why, in all conscience, the British government cannot replicate that scheme for people like them. I've tried to raise this issue with a number of different ministers on the floor of the House, and at best I get waffle, but really no substantive response. And I do think the government is dodging its responsibilities. Now, the honourable member for Lancaster and Fleetwood, who opened the debate so ably, has explained the catch-22 situation in which many Gazans find themselves unable to get out of Gaza. During the passage of the illegal migration bill, we were promised an announcement on safe and legal routes to the United Kingdom. But I raised that in the House again last week and was given a very vague and equivocal answer, and I would like to have a bit more detail today, but in particular, I want to know what urgent action is going to be taken in relation to this situation. Now, as has been said by others, the UK government has previously introduced bespoke pathways for those fleeing from persecution in Ukraine, Afghanistan and Hong Kong. And where Afghanistan and Hong Kong were concerned, we had particular historic and moral responsibilities. The proposed Gaza family scheme is modelled after the Ukraine family scheme, and it would enable applicants to apply to temporarily join their families here. That's all we're asking. It's not much to ask. These people will want to go back to their homeland. in the absence of a specific family route for them to leave Gaza and join family members in the UK, they can only seek to rely on existing routes which are extremely limited, such as the family visa or the skilled worker dependent visa. And in and of themselves, these pathways involve prolonged waits and hefty fees. Yes, I will. Yeah.
I agree with what she's saying. Did she acknowledge the point made by my honourable friend, the member for Lancaster, in opening this debate, that people taking one of the routes she's just suggested would need to apply for biometric deferral, and every single application since the 7th of October has been refused? Is she baffled by that, as I am, and will she ask the Minister to explain it? Why?
Well, I am, well, cynically, I'm not particularly baffled by it, because I know that this government has a strange attitude towards its international legal obligations in relation to refugees, and the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which I chair, has commented on that, and the weight of the evidence we took from a number of different sources was that this government doesn't really properly respect its obligations under the international treaties it's signed up to. So cynically, I'm not baffled, but I would like to know what the Minister's reason is for that. And whatever the reason is, the reality is, as the Honourable Member for Lancaster and Fleetwood said, these people are in a catch-22 situation. Even if they manage to get to Egypt, and of course the Rafah crossing is now closed, and the situation is rapidly deteriorating, which makes this request today all the more urgent. But even for those who, like my constituent's mother, have managed to get to Egypt, once they're there, they're trapped in limbo. They can't join their loved ones in the UK, because they can't join their loved ones in the UK for reasons I've already outlined. And they're also lacking access to state support to rebuild their lives, meaning that many of those who fled the war are now living in uncertainty and destitution in Egypt. So, in addition to the questions I've already posed for the Minister today, I want to ask him when, and if not, why not, the British Government will not facilitate the safe evacuation of people applying under existing routes, and in the longer term, and why they won't set up a bespoke route for Palestinians in Gaza to reunite with their immediate and extended family in the UK, including a waiver, deferral of biometric requirements until it is safe to return. What is the justification for not setting up a short-term scheme such as that we envisage? Does the Minister acknowledge the United Kingdom's historic debt to the Palestinian people, and what, in their most dire hour of need, is he going to do about it? Thank you.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Lancaster and Fleetwood for leading this debate. She's championed the cause of Palestinian people since we served in Young Labour maybe 20 years ago, and I'm really pleased to see she's still championing this cause here in the Chamber today. Maybe I have kind of given away how old we are, but it's just very pleased to see her championing this cause. Before I speak about a specific case that I want to draw to the Minister's attention, I just want to pay tribute to the bravery of those who've been living in Gaza throughout the conflict. My honourable friend from Blackburn said that we see the appalling scenes on TV and everyone has seen it, but when we go about our everyday lives, that's the reality for people who are living there, and I hope all the policies we make when we speak in the House, we remember the trauma and conflict that they're going through every day. I just want to turn to my constituent, whose brother's family have been forced to leave their home in southern Gaza after it was destroyed by aerial bombardment due to the fighting in the area. He moved with his wife and his 4 children. The youngest one is primary school age because he couldn't live there anymore and it was too dangerous. They arrived in Khan Yunis and they were forced to flee once again with the small children, the 4 of them, to the border in the city of Rafah due to the extension of the aerial bombardment to that area. The family are now living without access to water, to food, to basic hygiene facilities, and my constituent is receiving regular updates from his brother, who describes bombs landing less than 1 kilometre away from where he's sheltering with his wife and young children. And we know that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic, and my constituent is desperately worried about the safety of his brother and the young family, and he's been doing all he can to try and enable them to move to this country and be with their immediate family members. I wrote to the Home Office about this situation, and I'm very grateful for the speedy response that I had. But the reply I received made it even clearer how desperate the situation actually is. The government's answer was to inform my constituent that the visa application centre in Gaza is closed and to pass on the opening hours of the centres in Ramallah and Jerusalem. These seem to be done without any understanding of the complete impossibility of getting out of Gaza, and it's clear that families like the one in question that I'm talking about cannot access these centres, meaning that the government's advice on this is completely unrealistic. And while I do appreciate the detail of the government's answer, it's sadly nothing close to a solution for this family. And so I wanted to ask the Minister, is there any practical advice that desperately worried family members in the UK can pass on to their immediate family members who are going through this trauma at the moment? And this desperation has led to other constituents in similar situations asking me about advice about paying up to $5,000 per person to a private company in Egypt to get family out of Gaza. The companies put up their price up 14-fold since the outbreak of the conflict. It's complete exploitation, and it's not clear what someone in this position should do. They're ultimately being forced to consider extremely risky and extortionate routes because there's simply no other options available. There's no way of knowing the legitimacy of such routes, and also no way of guaranteeing that it will get them to safety. And even then, it's only an option for people who can actually get hold of that extortionate amount of money. So could I ask the Minister in his closing remarks to share any information he has on the use of these private companies as a route out of Gaza, as well as the official Foreign Office advice on regarding these private companies? And I want to know if the Minister could set out exactly what my constituents, who are British citizens living in Hampstead and Kilburn, who have immediate family in Rafah, should be saying to their terrified and vulnerable relatives, as well as any assessment that the government's made of what support these immediate family members of British citizens should be entitled to. I'm sure people in the chamber today, and it's a packed chamber, that the constituents' family that I'm speaking about, they're not alone. That nearly 75%... Yes, I'll get by.
She's right to make the point that her constituent's not alone. Many of us have taken up cases on behalf of Palestinians trapped in Gaza and have met the inflexibility that she describes from the government. Would she agree with me that that inflexibility is completely out of line with the feeling of the British people who, looking at the appalling situation in Gaza, would want the government to respond to this petition by saying, yes, we do now need to create routes for Palestinians to come into this country along the lines that she describes?
Julep Siddiq.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. What I would say is that my mother came to this country in the 1970s as a political asylum seeker because this country, and our country that we're proud of, has always been seen as a safe haven for people who are escaping conflict or escaping places that they can't live in because it's too dangerous for their lives. I think we need to show the same compassion for people right now who are fleeing unimaginable situations and trauma. So I do hope the government will listen, and I know the Minister will listen, on how the advice that we've been given is just not realistic on the ground. And we've got to have practical advice that we can give to our constituents who are constantly writing to us, petrified about their immediate family members. Nearly 75% of Gaza's total population has been displaced by this terrible conflict. Over 33,000 people have been killed. The fighting needs to stop, and everyone in this chamber will agree with that. There must be a ceasefire, the immediate release of hostages, and a serious political process towards a two-state solution. International law must be upheld in this conflict, and it's been deeply shocking to see reports that indicate that this may have been breached. The government must ensure that Israel is complying with international law, as well as the provisional measures set out by the International Court of Justice in January. Ministers have a duty to ensure that UK government themselves are fully compliant with international law when it comes to clear licensing criteria that applies to arms sales to Israel, given the developments in this conflict. And finally, just to end, because I know lots of people want to speak, we know that almost no aid is entering northern Gaza, and it's vital that aid is allowed in quickly as possible. The bleak picture that we see in Gaza is the situation of my constituents' family right now, and I'm desperate to help them. And we need the UK government to take the strongest possible position to ensure that we get an immediate ceasefire. But we also need the Minister, and I know he will listen in this debate, to look seriously at the desperate situation that people are seeing themselves in, with no one to turn to. And I look forward to hearing the Minister's advice on what I should say to my constituents who are desperately worried about their immediate families living through a war zone when they could be joining their brother and his family here in Hampstead and Kilburn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I don't need to reiterate how dire conditions are for Gazans. Members have set that out ably and movably. There's nowhere to go. There's very little medical assistance and there's almost nothing to eat. And ahead of its latest brutalising assault, Israel has designated the desert strip of Al-Mawasi as a humanitarian zone, and they degrade that word in the same way as they degrade the hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to exist there. We've debated at other times here and in the Chamber the other things that need to happen now in terms of immediate ceasefire, in terms of the release of all hostages, the restoration of aid, the suspension of the sale of arms, and hopefully in time the recognition of the State of Palestine, which I'm pleased to say that Ireland is due to do in the coming days, and meaningful progress towards a two-state solution, which is the only way that the people of that region are going to escape these cycles of hell. But this session is about the small things that we can do to support the small number of Gazan residents seeking to leave with direct and established residence here. As all members will know, and some have set out, current arrangements aren't working and people are literally dying for want of a solution. Members have set out that, of course, initially Gazans can't access biometrics. I wrote on behalf of a constituent and was cheerfully pointed to the other centres that were working throughout the region. We wrote to the British Embassy in Jerusalem, who didn't reply, and others, and my constituent Ahmed has been advised by immigration lawyers that his application will cost thousands of pounds per person, and of course has an extremely high rejection rate, and that excludes the approximately $5,000 now payable to a private company, Hala, who manage the border crossing from Egypt. My constituent Ahmed, and I'm not going to share his last name, he's going through the unimaginable at the moment, and I don't think we need to add that invasion of his privacy to that. But he's lived in Belfast for many years, working in industry, working in academia, contributing to the economic and the civic life of our city and the future of our region. He told me about how the last few months have been for his family. His father lost his hearing in a bomb. His mother sustained an arm injury, which continues to be infected. They were, of course, displaced from a home. They lost their business, a pharmacy, and he's just told me about the impossibility of maintaining anything approaching a dignified life. You could barely comprehend the toll on individual families. He spoke to me about the loss of his uncle, a blind man, about his cousin's niece and or his cousin's children, his niece and nephew, aged 5 and 7, and clearly, as so many of us have heard, the brunt is being borne by the old and the young. But he's been telling me about the daily struggle to meet their most basic needs, notably food and water and sanitation. And even if, please God, this phase of this war ends soon, we know that the infrastructure is devastated in that part of the world. Not everybody in Gaza is seeking to leave. Of course they're not. They just want to live peacefully in their home place. Small numbers will leave and go elsewhere in the region, but some in Gaza have their closest residents here, with the means to give them comfort and with the means to give them some sort of a future. And who of us in this room would not do exactly that for their parents or their close relatives if they were living in these circumstances? So the current impossible barriers in terms of biometrics, in terms of visa fees, in terms of high rejection rates and crossing fees, effectively mean we have no scheme. That's not just, it's not proportionate, it's not moral. And I would say to the Minister, there is a lot we could do that we're not doing. There's a lot we still are able to do. This is something practical that we can do, and I look forward to hearing the reasons why we don't proceed.
Tarry.
Your chairmanship, and of course I'd like to thank my honourable and good friend, the member for Lancaster and Fleetwood, for bringing this debate to the House today. I won't expatiate on just how severe this situation is. We've heard powerful speeches from many members from across the country, including my nearby neighbour in Poplar and Limehouse. I would just say this though: Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, has really now destroyed its moral integrity, and I think that many of us who talk to both people in Palestine and Israel know that if there isn't a just solution to this, if there isn't recognition for what has gone on, and if there isn't consequences for those that have advocated in the most extreme terms from the Israeli government the utter and complete destruction of Gaza and the human cost of that, the tens of thousands of children that have been slaughtered, then really that is the beginning of the end of an international rules-based order. Of course I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I couldn't agree more with what he's saying. The forcible displacement of civilian populations is always immoral, is unlawful, and it's what Israel has been doing to the Palestinian people. Would my honourable friend agree that in the response from the Minister later, what we need to see, as well as an agreement to this scheme proposed, is a clear confirmation from the government that the displacement, the forced displacement of millions of Palestinians by Israel cannot be allowed to be permanent?
Is that actually our country, particularly more than any other, has a historic duty because of our place and the role that we played in the creation of this problem and this issue and this conflict 75 years ago. And none of this House could stand and say they support international rules-based systems if not only are those people not held to account who have perpetrated this on both sides of the conflict, but also that those Palestinians one day will be able to return to a country that is rebuilt, that is free, and is able to be recognised by this country, as the Irish are about to do, and has been done last week in the UN. I think it is a moral as well as a humanitarian duty on all of us to do that, and I'll continue to push our side of the House to go as far as possible on that basis.
On that point,
absolutely.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend on the point of the international rules-based order system, which my honourable friend made reference to on a number of occasions. Would he agree with me that the blatant disregard and mockery of the international rules-based order system that has happened right before our eyes over the last few weeks and months is something that the international community should hang their head in shame? And again, when we talk about this scheme here today, would he agree with me that once again the double standards are being exposed?
I think that's a very pertinent point that my friend makes. It makes, no help at all to our international diplomatic efforts, our development efforts globally, when many countries in the global south are now able to turn to Russia, turn to China and say, look at the double standards of Britain, look at the double standards of the West. And so it's for that reason, I think, as well as the tens of thousands of constituents, of course, have written to me in Ilford, that we need to consider a scheme very similar to one that has been meaning that so many Ukrainians have been welcomed into our country, showing actually that people in Britain do have a great deal of compassion for their fellow humans, that they understood and see just the savage butchery going on in Ukraine. And in the same way, people in my community would welcome to their homes Palestinians, even just for a temporary period, who need the shelter of our nation and our people. Absolutely.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Like him, I am strongly supportive of such a bespoke scheme for Palestinians. But does he agree with me that as well as looking to the recent past in terms of government policy, we could look to the policies adopted by other countries around the world, such as Canada, who have given approval in principle to those seeking visas under family reunion schemes and supported them to get to Egypt so that all people eligible under their scheme can get there rather than being financially dependent in terms of having the money to get there in the first place. Does he agree with me that if that support was in place, then all Palestinians on an even basis could get out to a place of safety here in the UK, admittedly on a temporary basis?
My honourable friend makes a very good point. The Canadian scheme has a lot of merit, and I think it's one that I'd hope the government ministers look into properly. I mean, let's quickly remind ourselves, and I'll try and be very, very quick indeed. It was just 2 years ago the government swiftly introduced the Ukraine family scheme, and as part of that, it meant British citizens and permanent residents were able to sponsor a wide range of family members for visas, so for parents, siblings, aunts, cousins, nieces, and nephews. And that sponsorship scheme was open to Ukrainians with no family ties to the UK as well, and that scheme was also free of charge, and those visas last 3 years. Surely those things that could be brought forward would be an immediate way for all of us, including myself, including the Honourable Member for Hampstead Kilburn, and many others have given specific cases of individual Palestinians who have family both in the West Bank and indeed, of course, in Gaza, who are suffering so badly, that they could be given that safe path of refuge, that safe legal pathway. Nobody should be having to pay tens of thousands of pounds to get across the border at Rafah. We should be able to put in place things through our immigration system so those people can get those digital fingerprints in place. They can actually make those applications and do so in a way that's obviously right for our country, but of course allows those people to leave and leave quickly and to arrive on our shores and to safe haven as quickly as possible. And I believe actually that on top of that, those people should be able to work immediately, because many of those people are already are doctors, they are academics. The Gazan people are highly skilled and incredibly intelligent and well-educated workforce of people, and many of them would absolutely love to do that and give their contribution in return to safety from the refuge of the barbarity that they are facing.
Last Friday I held a public meeting in Denniston in Glasgow North East, my constituency, on what more people can do to help the people of Gaza. My constituents, like everybody else, are feeling utterly helpless, and it was really important to get people together to talk about it. And I've got several constituents who have family members trapped in Gaza right now. Some came along to that meeting, and they took great comfort to see so many people with no particular connection to Palestine turning out on a cold, rainy Friday night in Glasgow to ask what more they could do to help. We heard unique perspectives from the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire, who lived and worked in Gaza for 3 years, and from Dr Ibrahim Kadir, who is the chair of the Palestinian Community of Scotland, who told us that he has lost 70 members of his family. I want to thank them both again and thank my constituents for turning out to support Palestinians. I was also honoured to be asked to host a meeting here in Parliament for the Gaza Families Reunited campaign in March. This meeting gave the campaign group a platform to speak directly to MPs and peers about how and why we need a temporary family reunion visa scheme for Palestinians trapped in Gaza. I can't tell you how moving and how upsetting it was to hear directly from Amira, Roba and Ghassan, who are desperately trying to get their families out of Gaza. Family members who are starving under continual bombardment and who just don't know where is safe and where is not. In the UK government's response to this petition, they said there are no plans to introduce bespoke arrangements for people arriving from the region. Those wishing to come to the UK who currently have no visa can apply under one of the existing visa routes. Well, I've come to this debate directly from a meeting of the APPG on refugees and the first of our inquiries into the so-called safe and legal routes to the UK, which we hear so much about. I'm sure we'll hear them again. I can tell you, if I were to write down the safe and legal routes to the UK on a sheet of paper, it wouldn't even fill half a sheet of A4, and I could do it in really small writing and it still wouldn't. I actually find the government's response to this petition quite insulting. We're used to a lack of humanity in official responses, but this one is particularly cold. People arriving from the region doesn't begin to do justice to the true horror of the situation for the millions of people in Gaza who are desperate to escape to some kind of safety. And if I had one question for the Minister, it would be this. What are they so afraid of? We opened our doors, as we've heard, to all Ukrainians fleeing that war, and rightly so. Well, guess how many fleeing Ukrainians came here? 3% of the total. 3%. So what are they so afraid of? And there are no words to describe, although we're finding lots of words, but no words are adequate to describe the horror of what is happening in Gaza. And it just gets worse and worse. Israeli forces have closed the only way out, meaning no way out for people, no way in for essential aid. They've invaded the only supposed safe space in the entire region after explicitly directing millions of people to go there. And this morning we're being told that what remains of the healthcare system in Gaza is about to collapse due to a lack of fuel and aid. I mentioned the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire, and she spoke on Friday night of the Scottish-Palestinian Health Partnership, which has been set up. It's a memorandum of understanding between Glasgow University and the Arab American University of Palestine. I would encourage everyone to read up on the work that they're doing. It's really useful. The majority of people I speak to are stunned into silence when they discover that we're not helping people escape Gaza. The assumption is that, like Ukraine, we have some kind of scheme set up to help refugees find safety. Earlier I mentioned the APPG on refugees inquiry into so-called safe and legal routes, which started today, and we heard that the public assume we have a similar scheme for anyone fleeing war anywhere in the world, where they're going to be surprised when they discover the truth. This morning, on my way into this place, I had a conversation with someone, just a random person I bumped into in the street, about this debate and the petition, and the conversation went from general disbelief to the inevitable question, why is the government letting that happen? I told him about the rigmarole people are required to go through. We've talked about it. To get out of Gaza, you need to enrol your biometrics at a visa application centre. But that means travelling to such a centre, because you can't do this remotely. But guess where the nearest such centre is from Gaza? Egypt. You can't travel there because you can't leave Gaza without a visa. And if you do find the money to get out of Gaza, you find yourself in Egypt, you'll be at the mercy of a painfully slow decision-making process, or maybe even find that you're ineligible under any of the existing routes to safety. It's a terrible system, a system where profiteering is put before people, and the FCDO are letting it happen.
I wonder if she is aware, most of my Gaza residents and constituents who got out during the initial phase of the war with British family members, but they were allowed to bring their families with them, as were they in Israel, where the British government laid on flights for the British Israelis to be evacuated. And I wonder if she can seek from the Minister, because I have to leave to go to a different debate, an answer on what the costs were for our Gaza and Palestinian constituents compared to the scheme for those in the exact same conflict.
I absolutely will ask the Minister to answer that question. That doesn't mean that he will, because I quite often ask questions that never get answered, as do we all, but I hope he does try to answer it. I want to mention Roba from the Gaza Families Reunited campaign. She lives here in the UK. She crowdfunded to try to save her family's lives. She travelled herself to Egypt to pay the ransom, and as far as I know, her family are still not here. I would look up her story because it is harrowing. Mr. Chair, this is a call for a temporary solution, and it's a temporary solution just to help keep people alive. These people don't want to live here. They want to live in a free, rebuilt Palestine, and they deserve the right to do that, and we need to help them to do that. And finally, I would say to the Minister, because he's been shaking his head every time someone suggests that he and his government seem not to care. Well, some things, and he's shaking his head at me again, right? Some things are a political difference of opinion, right? This is a point-blank refusal to offer protection to human beings at risk of death. There is no other way to describe it. He should be fighting for these people. He should be using his power and influence as a British government minister to save their lives. And if he continues to refuse, he can shake his head all he likes, but he and we will all know the truth. And as I've said to him on other occasions about other issues in the past, is he and is his government really content in years to come to look back on what they did and on what they didn't do, and if not, do something. Do something.
For securing what's proved to be an extremely well-attended debate, at least as far as the opposition parties are concerned. I just want to challenge some of the false premises that the government's relied upon in denying a visa scheme, and some of the myths that have been put forward. The first of those is that in its policy, this aspect of its policy on migration, the government is doing something that is popular. The number of people who signed the petition in my constituency, the hundreds of people who've written to me in advance of the debate, suggests that that is far from the truth. It's also, I try and work closely with the refugee organisations in my constituency. I visited a couple of them a few days ago. One is Ukrainian Open House, which is organised every month by two of my constituents, Belinda Mitchell-Innes and Christian Halgill, and provides a whole raft of services and advice to Ukrainian refugees in the UK. And the other is West London Welcome, run by Joanne McInnes and Layla Williams, which caters to a wide range of asylum seekers, particularly those who are living in really appalling conditions in hotels and have been in that way, and supports them in every possible way, from providing food, providing counselling. Now, clearly, for reasons we all know about, they are not entertaining Palestinian refugees at the moment, but what was clear is that they are very insistent that the same rights should be extended as have been extended to other groups who've sought refuge in this country. I'm pleased to say that Ukrainian Open House was awarded a civic honour last week, as indeed the West London Welcome was in previous years. These are wonderful organisations, but they have the clear grassroots support of many, if not most, of my constituents. I would also, one of my more famous constituents, Lord Dubbs, who led a debate on this subject in the House of Lords last month, and he brings a unique perspective to this issue. And I'm afraid that there's some very good contributions from noble lords of very different parties, but a very, I'm afraid, say, flippant and dismissive response from the Minister there, which I hope won't be repeated today. I raised this issue with the Deputy Foreign Secretary a few weeks ago on the floor of the House, and as I didn't get an answer, I'm going to ask the same question again to the Minister now. What I asked then was this. I said every month in Hammersmith we hold Ukrainian Open House to bring together all those supporting Ukrainian families who have fled that war. Every month I'm asked why there are not similar visa schemes to allow Palestinians to join their relatives in the UK, or to be hosted by families who wish to give them refuge here. What's the government's answer to that? The answer, and I've had a great deal of time for the Deputy Foreign Secretary, but this was a very inadequate answer. The government's answer is that the two positions are not analogous. They are very, very different. The Honourable Member will know that we are doing everything we can to help individual cases in both instances, and we will continue to do so. Well, if the two situations are not analogous, I'd like to hear an exposition from the Minister in responding as to why that is the case. And I would challenge the Minister, as others have already in this debate, as to whether they are in fact doing everything they can, because that's another myth that is being perpetuated.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I know how passionate he is about this issue, and I think hearing from colleagues today about individual cases, it's really brought home what it means for those families that are involved and that are trying to contact people that are stranded in Gaza. But above all, the impression that I get talking to the community in Bristol is that sense of community injustice. So obviously they care about individuals, but unless this question is answered as to why we are not treating people the same as we are treating refugees from Ukraine, the suspicion is that because they feel that they are somehow being blamed for the crisis in Gaza, and they are not. They are innocent civilians that are in the grip of a terrible humanitarian catastrophe, and they need our support just as much as people in Ukraine.
That is a very good point that my old friend makes, and I'll come on to that briefly in a moment. Just to return to what the government said, this is a quote from the government's response to the petition today. There are currently no plans to introduce bespoke arrangements for people arriving from the region who do not hold permission to come to the UK. That means that immediate family members of British citizens and those settled in the UK who wish to come and live in the UK and do not have current UK visa can apply under one of the existing family visa routes. Individuals who meet this criteria should apply for a visa to enable them to enter the UK in the normal way. And then it helpfully tells people that the visa application centres at Egypt, Jordan and Turkey are open and operating a full service. Well, they're probably not too busy, are they? Because there aren't many people from Gaza turning up there. I mean, I regard that as just a cynical and callous response to what the government's been asking. Again, I hope we will hear something a little better from the ministers today. I will, just one more time. Yeah.
Very briefly, the honourable member is making an excellent point, and after years of casework experience, would he agree with me that it's unusual, hearing from another member in the debate, that the mission in Jerusalem failed to reply to a member of Parliament? Does he think that is lacking respect and lacks an understanding of what we as MPs are faced with daily with our casework?
Yes. Well, I don't know whether it's the embassy in Tel Aviv or the consulate in Jerusalem. I always found the consulate in Jerusalem very helpful, perhaps not so much the other. The last point I want to make in terms of these false premises is the idea that this is a way that Gazans and Palestinians are going to come to the UK and live in the UK permanently. That's never been alleged against Ukrainians, and we know the passion in which Ukrainians want to return as soon as they can to their homeland. The same is true to a greater extent than anybody who's visited the region, who like me has visited Gaza several times, and visited the West Bank and spoken to Palestinians, is above all, they want the right to live in their own country, under a country recognised internationally and a country which is governed by the rule of law. And it's nearly 80 years the Palestinians have been campaigning for the right to return to their country, and it's frankly insulting to say that they are looking for a way to permanently. And there is a Palestinian diaspora around the world. There's a Palestinian diaspora in refugee camps throughout the Middle East. What most Palestinians want is to be able to live in a free and democratic Palestinian state. So I'll bring my remarks to a close, Mr. Vickers, but just to say this, I do regard this is a very important debate, but it's on one aspect, and perhaps not the most brutal aspect of what's going on in Gaza at the moment. And I begin to get sickened about the way that our government is dealing with this matter. It's like it's a passive observer. Is Israel breaking international law at the moment? Have they in fact crossed a red line by what they're doing in Rafah at the moment? As we're not selling very much by way of armaments, then perhaps it doesn't matter or make a big difference to the number of people killed. These are deeply degenerate and obscene attitudes when we see every day on television or social media how children are being killed in their thousands. We have not said the right things. The government has not even called for a ceasefire as yet. Now, maybe if they had done all those things, then maybe it wouldn't have made a difference, but at least we should be on the right side morally of the argument. And this today, what we're debating today, is one thing we can do. We can give relief to those Palestinians who are in such extremis and who need to come here, who will be welcomed by people in the UK, whether they are their family or whether they are people who just generously want to give them aid and succour. And I urge on the Minister in response both to respond fully to this debate, which his colleagues have avoided doing, but also to show some sympathy and humanity to those who are suffering in Palestine.
Mr. Vickers, I'm going to leave aside the fact that this is all entirely hypothetical at this point, because Israel has seized the Rafah crossing in absolute breach of the Camp David Accords, which have the power of international law having been adopted by the Security Council. The Philadelphia corridor is completely sealed, and this is the 4th day in a row where exactly none, food or medical aid has entered Gaza. And therefore, even if the British government moved their show to the border, no Palestinian would be able to get biometric tests anyway. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Lancaster in securing this debate and commiserate with the Minister who's going to have to try and answer the literally unanswerable, to defend the literally indefensible. Sometimes one detests a government policy, but can understand why they're doing it. It is impossible to fathom why the government is resisting the entirely inexpensive demand that this debate, this petition, is asking for. Hundreds, 391 of the signatories are my constituents in Rochdale, who are always looking for ways to demonstrate their support for the Palestinian cause. As you'll know, Mr. Vickers, and I declare the interest that one of my parliamentary staff is one of those trying to get their family out of Gaza to no avail. The attendance at this session today is evidence of the massive support there is in the country for the plight of the Palestinian people to be at least palliated by our government, and it could be done so inexpensively, I literally cannot fathom why the Minister is going to rise and resist the demands made by the Honourable Lady, the Member for Lancaster. Leaving aside all the historical reasons why they should, the fact that it was in this very building that the entire Palestinian tragedy was authored, when, on behalf of one people, our government promised to a second people the land that belonged to a third people. You would have thought that that would have been a matter of historical guilt for our government, that they might want to in some way mitigate. Leaving aside the fact that hundreds of our soldiers, police officers, civil servants, staff of this very house were murdered in the King David Hotel. Our soldiers left hanging by piano wire in the orange groves of Jaffa, booby-trapped. Shouldn't the government have a scintilla of guilt, responsibility for what has happened to the Palestinian people in the past and in the last 7 months? It isn't true that our military aid to Israel is minuscule. If you define it by completed pieces of ordnance, maybe. But our components are in most of Israel's bombs and rockets that are falling down on these poor people in Gaza, defenseless prisoners in what the Prime Minister, then David Cameron, now the Foreign Secretary, described as the largest open-air prison in the world. And he went on to say it must not be allowed to remain so. That was in 2010. Now he's the Foreign Secretary in 2024. He turns his face away from the people in that prison camp that he said must not be allowed to remain so. And it isn't just ordnance. We have flown 200 missions from our sovereign base in Akrotiri in Cyprus. Who knew that we have a sovereign base in independent Cyprus, a European Union country, an allied country, but we have the right to fly whatever we like out of that sovereign base. And 200 times we have flown spy missions over Gaza for the edification of Netanyahu and his gang in power in Tel Aviv. So our contribution to this massacre is very significant, both historically and contemporaneously. And what we're asking here, people from all sides, some of them actually, literally, capital F, friends of Israel. But they're all here asking for one small thing, that you at least allow people who are citizens here, who are contributing here, to get their old mother out of Gaza, rather than actually see her, perhaps, on their telephone, being torn to shreds by a bomb that wouldn't have been as effective if it weren't for the components being given from British factories and targets being assisted by RAF jets flying out of Akrotiri. For goodness sake, Minister, have some political nous. There's millions of people in Britain want you to do something. This you can do with a stroke of a pen, and it won't cost you anything in your popularity stakes with Netanyahu in Tel Aviv.
Stuart C. MacDonald. Thank you, Mr Holloway. Can I congratulate everybody who has been involved in supporting the petition, and also the committee chair for her excellent introduction to the debate, and I proudly put on record my full support for a Gaza family scheme. It is impossible, Mr Holloway, to imagine the fear and the terror that every single morning must bring to people who have loved ones living in the midst of the utter carnage in Gaza. And in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe, is it really the Home Office's response to do nothing or to change nothing? That cannot seriously be an acceptable response. Now, the Minister in his reply almost certainly will point to how the Home Office responded positively, engaged positively in light of the horrors unfolding in Ukraine or indeed Hong Kong. But as others have pointed out, those welcome measures simply beg the question, why on earth not Gaza as well? It really is not actually a big ask. It is, in fact, the very least that we can do. So, Mr Holloway, the existing rules are quite simply not working, and they are not sufficient. Whether a person can join family members here will first of all depend on the type of leave, the category of leave or visa that that family member has, whether it's as a refugee or with humanitarian protection, or as a UK citizen or with settled status, or with some form of temporary leave, such as for study or for work. But given the hellish circumstances in Gaza, the right to be joined by family fleeing catastrophe should not depend on the type of leave that a person has. And we also must be much more generous about the category of family members that can apply to join. So it's not just immediate family members, but parents, siblings, nieces and nephews and so on. We in this room would all want, indeed we would all demand precisely the same if it was our relatives that were in this very same situation. Similarly, Mr Holloway, the fees and charges that would generally apply to many applications, often amounting to several thousands of pounds when the immigration health surcharge is also included, these should be waived. We cannot make family unity in the face of these untold horrors dependent on a person's wealth. And regardless of what changes the Home Office makes, or even if it refuses to make any changes at all, the practical processes for dealing with these applications must also be fixed and improved. Even for those fortunate enough to qualify for family reunion or another visa that enables them to get here, these applications are taking far too long, with many being left in destitution and in limbo, usually in Egypt, where resident rights are often very quick to expire, along with any access to education if you're a kid, or to healthcare, or to housing. And that, of course, is if they're lucky enough to get as far as Egypt. As we've already heard, the closure of the Rafah crossing makes this almost impossible. And even while that crossing was open, while the UK government would provide lists of British citizens who were thereby entitled to cross at Rafah into Egypt, no such facility was granted to many Palestinians, even if they are or could have been able to join family here in the United Kingdom. Instead, such people were left to be subject to essentially extortion by an Egyptian company called Hala and forced to pay $5,000 per adult or $2,500 per child in cash to cross, and only first-degree relatives of people physically present in Egypt could even do that. That cost meant people, therefore, were having to make absolutely impossible choices. They were having to start their journeys with a crowdfunder, and then they had to ask themselves, well, we've got enough to bring perhaps a parent, or perhaps we should take a niece instead. What a choice to leave folk to make, Mr Hollowbone. The ability to reunite with family in safety should not be open to such extortion, and people should not be left to face such choices. So we call on the government to work with counterparts to ensure and to secure evacuation from Gaza of individuals with UK family members without being subject to that additional worry, just like, as we've heard, the Canadians have managed. But more than anything, I'll happily give way to my old friend.
I thank him for his point. I, like others, have been trying to get people out of Gaza and here to a place of safety with their relatives in the UK, and I, like others, have been advised by the Home Office that there are schemes available that people should apply to. And I, like others, have found that the barriers to those schemes, the level of evidence required and the costs involved mean they are simply not appropriate and not effective. Isn't it the case, really, that by design the existing schemes cannot work in a situation where there is ongoing conflict in an emergency situation? And that is why we need a new scheme.
Is absolutely right. The existing visa schemes were not designed to help people out of a war-torn hellhole. They were designed to allow folk to come here as family members, spouses, or to study or to work. We need a bespoke arrangement that is designed for the catastrophe that is unfolding before our very eyes.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I mean, surely the point's actually worse than that, because these rules are so outrageous that every person, even who wasn't familiar with these rules, will tell you instantly that they are not going to work, because people simply cannot get to the place where they need to get the required documents from. And would he agree with me that in recent times, the tragedy of this is the two places we've seen this is we first saw this where 1 million people, the Rohingya in the Cox's Bazar, where similar restrictions were put in place, and we're now seeing the same restrictions with 1.4 billion people in Rafah, further exposing the double standards.
I thank him for that intervention. And again, I simply repeat the point. This system is absolutely not designed for the circumstances that we're seeing unfolding, and it is imperative that the government gets its finger out and designs a suitable bespoke scheme. But the final issue I want to address, I want to join other members in calling on the Minister to rethink the utterly wrong-headed approach that his department is taking to biometrics in war-torn countries. Now, a few months back, I had a very similar adjournment debate on this topic with his predecessor, it was, but in the context of the country of Sudan. In Gaza, then, as with Sudan, there is, of course, no possibility of in-country biometrics being provided alongside the visa application. So surely, as we're all arguing, the common-sense approach is to consider applications and to defer the biometric enrolment. And if, subject to those biometrics, an application is to be allowed, the applicant can then commence their journey and provide biometric information either on arrival here, or if the Home Office isn't willing to go that far, in a third country such as Egypt. But rather than making things easier, Mr Hollowbone, the Minister actually seems to have made this position tougher through new guidance about when exceptions to biometric enrolment would apply. And that is why, as we've heard, not a single application to defer biometrics has been granted by the Home Office since Israel began its offensive in Gaza. That is utterly incomprehensible in the circumstances. Basically, it now seems not enough that the general country situation makes it impossible, literally, to have the biometrics enrolled there. So people are essentially left with a choice. They either have to take an almighty gamble and make dangerous and often illegal journeys to neighbouring countries to enrol the biometrics without even knowing whether they will then be allowed onwards to the United Kingdom, or they give up. And making people make that decision is astonishingly cruel. Now, in a letter that the Minister subsequently wrote to me, he set out some reasons, which I suspect we'll hear again today, justifying that approach in relation to Sudan, and I suspect we'll hear the same today in relation to Gaza. And basically, the letter repeatedly made the point that biometric information is vital for security. But, Mr Hollowbone, nobody is disputing that point. We are just asking for a reasonable approach as to when that biometric information needs to be provided. Not that it's waived altogether. We understand the importance of these checks, but the Minister cannot be oblivious to the horrible problems that his department's approach are causing people who want to leave Gaza. Frankly, the absence of any other good reason creates the impression that the Home Office is more bothered, actually, about suppressing the number of applications rather than any real point of principle, and that's a very depressing thought. Mr Hollowborn, reuniting people from hellish war zones with family here in the UK is something that we should celebrate doing. We call on the government to facilitate that rather than to obstruct it. And so a family scheme for Gaza families, has my full support. And as I say, it is not a big ask. It is the very least the government should be doing.
Hear, hear.
Olivia Blake.
Fleetwood for the diligent way in which she started this debate and highlighted many of the issues that we're covering. I'd quickly like to point to the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests for the help I received from the Refugee Asylum and Migration Policy project in this area, and I am also the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Migration. The thousands of people who have signed this petition triggering this debate should be assigned to everyone here today. The signatories show that there is a significant support and compassion for those who are fleeing both violence and destruction of war, and for welcoming refugees into our communities. We saw the same with Ukraine, with people opening their homes and the reunification of families meaning so much to people. I have raised questions about other schemes for other conflicts, such as Sudan, showing that the approach by the Home Office is seemingly case by case, but the underlying overarching policy is simply not fit for purpose for those who are fleeing from war and persecution. With Ukraine, the government rightly responded by waiving all fees, salary thresholds and language tests under the Ukraine Family Scheme. This programme opened applications to all civilians in need, and it significantly reduced the visa paperwork. For those who couldn't reach a visa application centre, they swiftly were issued with permission to travel letters on the basis that applicants could finish the process in the UK. They also extended the use of the UK Immigration ID Check app to Ukrainian nationals. This allowed applicants to enrol digitally with their biometrics using a mobile phone. These measures show that what can be done when the public support for those trapped in conflict meets the political will, that something can be done in Westminster, showing that there are solutions to the challenges, and no doubt we will hear from the Minister shortly. And yet, despite the mass support for the family scheme for Palestinians, we have seen no action from ministers on Gaza. In fact, not only has this government refused to implement a similar scheme, they won't even waive the fees or relax the biometric requirements for making a standard immigration application. I'd like to use this opportunity to ask the Minister whose crisis counts. What is the difference between a Palestinian fleeing the bombs overhead in Gaza and a Ukrainian doing the same in Kyiv? In his written response about whether they would consider introducing a similar family scheme for those in Gaza, the Minister stated that in any humanitarian situation, the UK must consider its resettlement approach in the round rather than on a crisis-by-crisis basis. The inaction of ministers suggests that they've not considered their approach at all, let alone in the round. People in Gaza with family members in the UK remain trapped with no safe or viable routes to reunite with their families. Without a specific family route, they can only rely on existing routes such as family visa or skilled worker dependent visas. But to make these applications is nearly impossible. The closest and most viable visa application centre is in Egypt, on the other side of the Rafah crossing, which we have heard is currently under assault and for some days now has been completely closed. I understand that it is possible to apply for deferral to biometric enrolment requirements, which I'm sure the Minister will say, but could the Minister please tell us how many of those deferrals have actually been granted? Is the number still standing at zero? Given the unparalleled threat to civilian life in Gaza and the UK's historic involvement in Palestine, it's hard to understand why the British government hasn't simply adopted the approach it took in Ukraine. To the people out there, it looks completely wrong, completely wrong. And it would be wrong of me not to also stress that rather than ad hoc schemes for individual crises and countries, a solution would be to lift the government's in-practice ban on asylum applications. We need more safe routes and more safe passage to the UK so that people who are facing war and conflict, the majority, wanting to come here, are children, people with injuries, people who have family here. In the absence of either safe routes or safe passage visas, it's time that the government did the bare minimum and introduced an emergency family reunion scheme for those seeking shelter from the bombing and the crises in Gaza.
Ribeiro Eddy.
Thank you, Chair, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Lancaster and Fleetwood, for securing this very important debate. As the IDF ramps up operations in Rafah, there are no remaining safe zones left in Gaza. Nearly 35,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 75,000 injured, and more than 1.5 million displaced. I know members have heard these figures before, but I think it's important that we repeat them as often as possible. People who have already been forced out of their homes are having to flee once again. According to an interim damage assessment conducted by the World Bank and the UN, $18.5 billion worth of damage to critical infrastructure has been done. 74% of this is housing, and 84% of health facilities in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Those that are left are barely functioning. Doctors are having to amputate children and perform C-sections without anaesthetic. It's worth restating the fact that under the Geneva Conventions, the forcible transfer of civilian population is a war crime, as is the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Yet even after the ICJ ruling, our government's decision to keep supplying military hardware to Israel and our government's failure to push for a lasting ceasefire mean that the UK is wholly complicit in creating the conditions for the humanitarian crisis we are now witnessing. We have a responsibility to help those suffering. I will give way.
Me?
Excellent speech that she's outlining. A number of members this afternoon have highlighted the Ukrainian scheme and the fact that that was dependent on our local councils welcoming and helping families in our boroughs. My honourable friend and I share the same borough in Lambeth. Lambeth was awarded the Borough Sanctuary in December 2022, recognising the fact that people want to help. Our constituents want to help, aided with the council. Does she agree that one of the things that the government need to do in response to what she's just highlighted is have a full, proper assessment why they don't have a scheme in place, like many members have said this afternoon?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she's absolutely right. The government should have a full assessment. But unfortunately, the government's response to the plight of Palestinian refugees has been typical of their punitive approach to people seeking safety. Now, I found this out for myself when a constituent of mine attempted to apply for his family members to join him in February. They were rejected because they couldn't provide biometric data. But I was appalled to actually find this out in writing, that the Home Office actually wrote this down, that this is because the government expects Palestinian refugees from Gaza to apply in Ramallah or Jerusalem or in a nearby country, effectively telling people to travel through an active war zone to submit this information. Besides the current conflict, Gaza has been under blockade for years. People from Gaza do not casually leave and travel and go to different parts of the country. They simply do not. His Majesty's Home Office should be embarrassed to send such a ridiculous and ignorant response. And if they're not embarrassed, I am thoroughly embarrassed for them. Those seeking to leave Gaza are trapped in a catch-22 because of this situation. They can't enrol their biometrics because they can't leave Gaza, and they can't leave Gaza because they can't enrol their biometrics. According to the Gaza Families Reunited campaign, at least 2 Palestinians are now known to have died while waiting for the Home Office to decide on their applications. My constituent says, I do not think I'm being treated fairly at all. I came to the UK on a work permit and I've never applied for assistance from the UK government. He just wants the UK government to help his family. Now, it's hard to argue with this because when millions were displaced by Russia's appalling invasion of Ukraine in 2021, the government had the Homes for Ukraine scheme live in a matter of weeks. It's right that this happened, and I believe the government hasn't done enough for Ukrainian refugees. However, when the conflict began in Gaza and thousands and over a million were displaced, where was the Homes for Palestinian scheme? All options are closed to my constituents' family, and it's worth repeating that the Home Office has rejected every single request for biometric deferral and predetermination since the 7th of October. The response I got when I wrote to the Home Secretary, or wrote to the Home Office again, was this. They said to my constituent, I have considered whether there are compelling, compassionate circumstances in your case which would warrant a grant of leave outside of the immigration rules. However, based on the information you have provided, I have decided there is no such circumstances in your case. 35,000 killed, over 75,000 injured, people starving and 1.5 million displaced. But there is no such circumstances that our Home Office can see that they should grant people outside of the current immigration rules. That is an absolute disgrace. Now, in comparison, between the 15th of March 2022 and the 7th of December 2023, Ukrainian nationals could apply online without the need to enrol their biometrics until after reaching safety in the UK. Again, this was absolutely right to do, but why are Palestinians being denied the same conditions and compassion? When the Minister responds, I want to understand the government's justification for these double standards. And I want the Minister to understand why there are so many people right across this country that believe those reasons revolve around racism and geopolitics. There is nothing that Palestinians want more than a safe return to their home. But the inordinate civilian death toll in this conflict means that, sadly, many Palestinians simply will not be alive to exercise this right. From the Skies Picket Agreement to the Balfour Declaration, the betrayals of McMahon and the invasion of Allenby's forces, we have to acknowledge that it was long-standing British policy to displace Palestinians from their homes. This shared colonial history means that we have a unique responsibility towards Palestinian refugees and a particular responsibility to push for peace in the region. It is one that this government has completely shirked so far. So I urge the Minister to listen to the thousands who have signed this petition, including hundreds of my own constituents, and create a Palestinian family reunion scheme. And as well as supporting people displaced by the war in Gaza, we need the government to do something about the root causes of this displacement. That means suspending arms sales and pushing for an immediate and permanent ceasefire.
Hear, hear.
I think if you look at the number of people who've been here for this debate, and remember a lot have had to go because there's another very important debate about to start in the chamber, we're now almost 2 hours into the debate and there hasn't been a single word spoken in defence of this government's position on Gaza family reunification visas. And a lot of members are trying to understand why, and I struggle, and I really don't want it to be the answer, but I think the answer is because the government have become so obsessed with the view that immigration, any immigration, is a bad thing that has to be stopped, if at all possible. They've become so obsessed with the way that somebody calculates net immigration. They've worked out if we allow a small handful of desperate Gazan citizens to come here, that will increase net inward migration, and that is a bad thing. Is that where we have come to, Mr Holloway? Is that where the toxic, poisonous debate over immigration this place has had for the last 7 or 8 years? Is that where it's taken us to? That we have a government that quite literally, and I make no apology for saying it, a government would quite literally see innocent, defenceless, desperate people dying rather than allow them safe passage and sanctuary among families on these islands who will look after them for as long as they have to look after them. My honourable and learned friend mentioned an elderly lady who has 2 daughters in the UK, one living in Edinburgh, and my constituent, Dr Lubna Hadura, 30 years service as a consultant in our NHS, has never asked for anything. She has saved lives of my constituents and others. Now she needs our help. And the response that came most recently from this minister, the same as the responses that come from other ministers, I suspect it's word for word the same as the responses that every MP here has had, and it's almost identical to the response or non-response to this particular petition. The minister was very upset, from an honourable friend from Glasgow, said some quite unpleasant home truths about the government's attitude. But what I'll say to him is, if he wants to take the last response he sent to me as Dr Hadura's MP, and if he wants to sit down with her and read to her the reasons why her mum is not allowed to come to be looked after, let him do it. Because I haven't given that letter to her yet. I can't. I can't bear to inflict on my constituent the absolute horror that she will feel when she sees how unfeeling this government, the government that she has paid taxes to for decades, how unfeeling this government is to the plight of her elderly mother, and by clear implication to the plight of well over 1 million other of our fellow human beings. I can't understand it. I can't even begin to explain to my constituent why it is that her mum and so many others are just being abandoned. In this case, this lady has managed to escape from Gaza. I haven't asked questions about how they got her out. It's maybe better that I don't know. But as my honourable and learned friend referred to, this 79-year-old lady has had more home addresses in the last 7 months than I've had in the 63 and a half years that I've been alive. 79 years old. Most of the time she'd been displaced, of course, it was under fire. Very often literally running the gauntlet of Israeli snipers who would take it in themselves just to shoot random civilians, just to make the point that they could. And yet that's not sufficient grounds to say these people have got to be got out of Gaza while there is still a chance. I know it's not comfortable, and my constituent here and her mum talked about in this way, but I need to go through some of what she's experienced. 6 months without any privacy whatsoever, and I mean literally no privacy at all for a 79-year-old woman. No toilets, no sanitation. 6 months without a bath or a shower. 6 months without the medicines that she needs to maintain any kind of standard of living. 6 months without being able to sleep for more than a couple of hours at a time. 6 months where every single time she went to sleep, as well as the prayer she says every night when she goes to sleep, she would say the prayer of submission before death, because she never knew for 6 months, when she closed her eyes, she never knew if she would ever open them again. That lady is desperately traumatised. She's so confused that when my constituent managed to go over to Cairo to spend some time with her, she found her sitting in the dark because she'd forgotten that there was electric lights. You just pressed a switch on the wall and the light came on, because there had been no electric lights in so much of Gaza for so long, just as there had been no power, no heating, no water, no sanitation, no shelter, no food, no medicines, no anything. And one of the earlier speakers said this is maybe not the most brutal aspect of the horrors of Gaza. I think it is, because the fact that these people are not able to get out of here is something that this government has got the power to change on its own. We don't need the permission of anyone else. We don't need intense diplomatic efforts. We don't need the threat of sanctions or embargoes or anything like that. All we need to do is say to people, it's difficult to get your families out of Gaza, but you get them out of Gaza and we will get them here. It's not international law or treaties or anything else that is preventing the government from saying that. They're not saying it because they have chosen that the political priority is not to bring these people to these islands. And I have to say to the Minister that if that is a genuine view of the government, then it's clear from this debate that it's not the view that's shared by the majority of this House. I don't think it's the view that's shared by their own backbenchers. Where are they? Where are they to speak on behalf of this policy? Nobody wants to defend it publicly. If my constituents are anything to go by, and I don't believe they're any more decent or caring or humanitarian than constituents of the other 649 MPs here, if my constituents are anything to go by, there is a massive majority of the people of these islands who are saying to us, yes, we know it will cause difficulties. Yes, we know it is an exceptionally unusual step to take, but it's what we have to do. We can't go on watching more and more innocents killed on our television screens, knowing that we have it within the power of our government to get some of them out and yet doing nothing about it. The elder lady I spoke about a while ago, she's now in Egypt, so she's not going to be killed tonight. She still has got no entitlement to food, no entitlement to healthcare. Her family had to spend a lot of money on the healthcare that she desperately needed when she escaped from Gaza. Egypt doesn't owe her anything. Why is it up to Egypt? Yep. Simply because of an accident of geography, Egypt is where she landed up. She's got no ties to Egypt whatsoever. She does have ties to Fife. She's got ties to Edinburgh. She's got ties to the United Kingdom. She's got family in these places who will look after her for as long as it takes, who will do whatever they have to do for her, until the one day in her life that she now longs for arrives, and she can go back to a Palestinian homeland that is once again fit for human beings to live in. Because right now, thanks to this country's great ally, Israel, Gaza is not fit to sustain human life on any scale, and certainly not fit to sustain human life on the scale of the numbers who are trapped in Gaza just now. Why can't the government just own up to the fact that in amongst all the rhetoric, there is no safe legal route out of Gaza? There is none. There is absolutely no safe legal route for people to get out of Gaza. The government don't want to admit that. Why not? As I said, the government are clearly out of touch with the people. They're very clearly out of touch with the will of Parliament. I think they're out of touch with the will of their own backbenchers. They're becoming increasingly out of touch with any kind of humanity, any kind of care for our fellow human beings, wherever they might be on this planet. And the excuses that they give for not acting, they suggest that the law says they don't have to, and international diplomacy said this, and treaties say that. I'm not asking the Minister to agree to this because the law says we have to. I'm pleading with him, begging with him to do it, because the collective conscience of this House, and I'm convinced the collective conscience of the people of these islands, is get these people out of Gaza, not because we have to, but because we can.
Thank you, Mr. Hollivan. And I want to thank my colleague and friend for introducing the debate today, the Honourable Member for Lancaster and Fleetwood. Mr. Hollivan, we've heard from many colleagues today about stating what's happening in Gaza now. And we see it on our screens every day. It's not as if this is being done in secrecy. It is being done very openly, and the whole world is watching and have been watching for months and months and months. They've heard the various leaders of Israeli government and their comments, such as the Palestinians or the Gazans are the Amaleki, or the fact that the leaders and the defense ministers and the generals are saying they're not human beings, they should be in the Sinai desert, or the minister who looked at the complete devastation of Gaza and said, oh, this is such a beautiful site, we're looking forward to building our homes in there. And of course, we've seen the relentless bombing. And we've seen children, their limbs blown up, women, adults, other people damaged. We've heard people's skins peeling out. We've seen real crimes being committed in front of our eyes. Yet, all we have is platitude by all the leaders in the world. Well, Israel is, going to abide by international law, or the IDF is the most moral army in the world. Well, I don't know whether it is a moral army or not. All I would say to people is, please see what is actually happening in Gaza and draw your own conclusion at what's going on there. But we also have a situation now where there is water, there is food, there is clothes, there is medicine. Everything is available, generators, so that we can help the people in Gaza who are now stuck in a tiny little space, 1.5 million of them displaced. Yet, this is not a natural famine, this is not a natural disaster. This is purely and simply because the Israeli government will not let aid in, and the Israeli illegal settlers playing their part in as well as to stop aid getting in. Yet, what is our moral international governments doing about this? We can see it. Why is it that no one seems to be taking real steps to help the Palestinian people, to get food in there? Yes, we've had a bit of food aid drops in, but that's nothing compared to what is needed. So I would say to the international community, and I'll come on to the debate for this afternoon, is that apart from those people, and there's only, I'm sure, a small amount, who are able to leave Gaza and join their families in the United Kingdom, why that is not happening. We see that destruction, and as many colleagues have said, these people are not going to be burden on the taxpayers or even the state, because their family and friends will look after them, would pay for them. And I know that these people will go back to their homeland, because one of the reasons so many Palestinians are stuck in the Rafah and where they are won't want to leave is because they know that if they left Palestine, the chances of them being able to get back into it would be virtually negligible, because we saw what happened in the 40s. The Nakaba, 700,000 people were expelled forcibly. Not any of them have been able to come back. Them, their families and children now are languishing are languishing in tents in Lebanon, in Jordan, and the rest of the countries surrounding. And they're now coming up to about 4 or 5 million of those people who've been displaced. And for 75 years, everybody in the national community has talked about, yes, the Palestinians will be able to come back, or a homeland for the Palestinians. Nothing has happened. So I know those people who will leave, virtually all of them will want to go back. Although, of course, as somebody said, the level of devastation in Gaza is absolutely horrendous. Now, I know, I'm sorry to say, the Home Office attitude towards Palestinian refugees or even Palestinian visitors has over the years been incredibly harsh. I want to thank a lady called Julia Simpkin, who's a teacher in Bolton. She regularly, every year, calls and gets young Palestinian students to come over from West Bank and Gaza and other places to Bolton and Manchester, and they get taken around for about a week. But last time she tried to do this, a few years back, they declined the visa without giving any reason whatsoever. These are children. But no explanation given, just a complete high and mightiness of the Home Office. Yet when we see what happens in relation to Ukraine and other places, where we rightly intervene to help people, yet we don't seem to be able to offer the same degree of courtesy or the same degree of help to the Palestinian people. I ask, what is it about the Palestinians that's so different from Ukrainians? Because I can assure you the perils and the suffering they have is just as great, if not greater. Not that one should be comparing sufferings of any one group of victims to another group. So what I would say to the government, this won't cost them money. And as the honourable member who introduced this debate and other colleagues have said, the scheme already exists. It's literally copy and paste and apply it to the circumstances in Gaza and make the rules easy as well so that people can get out. And the final thing I would ask the government, whilst they're looking at this issue, and we know the whole issue of Gaza is a much bigger issue, is when we had again Ukraine, many children who had been severely damaged, had amputation, we had about 150 of them accepted in British hospitals by the British government, who paid for them to have limb reconstruction surgeries and other, or treat them for chemotherapy, cancer patients. Yet, not a single Palestinian child has been accepted, not a single Palestinian child has been offered that service, despite the fact that the hospitals, like the Greater Ormond Street hospitals, management is happy to take the children, but none has been taken. I really would ask the government to look into their conscience. Why? What's the difference between a Palestinian child and a Ukrainian child?
Here.
I'd like to follow up the Honourable Lady with regard to the evacuation of children. But can I just say, I want to echo what others have said. There's been absolute unanimity in this room today, across all political parties as well, representatives from each of the political parties. I've not seen that in this chamber, possibly ever. And I think the government needs to recognise that. And it's borne upon, to be honest, accumulating concern, anger, distress about what we've experienced. Some months ago, when this initial proposal came up, many were conflicted at that stage about whether or not it should be supported. And they were conflicted within the Palestinian community as well, because people did not want to be seen to be complicit with what was, exactly as the Honourable Lady said, a second Nakba. Yeah. And many thought at that stage that Palestinians themselves, that they would remain within Gaza because it would be a limited action, because they thought, all of us thought, I think, naively, that the world wouldn't stand by and watch this take place on this scale, a Nakba. And I don't think anyone calculated the level of killings that would take place. No one, I think, at that stage had any understanding of the scale of the deaths among children in particular. That's why I think there was that sort of conflation. There was a real contradiction in people's minds about whether to go forward. What's interesting, as the time has moved on and the situation has got so desperate, we've heard the stories today, people are just desperate to do anything to help and save life. The obvious solution to this is peace, a ceasefire. The obvious solution is this government, along with others, telling the mass murderer, that's the Prime Minister of Israel at the moment, to halt the attack on Gaza. But that's not forthcoming at the moment. So at least what they can do is allow people to gain access to security. Do you know, there are some Palestinians who have gained access to security. Some of them in the hotels in our constituencies. But they haven't gone through the route allowed by the government. They've come on the boats across the channel. And here's the irony. They're now part of the categories that will be targeted for Rwanda. I just think there's an inhumanity about the way the Palestinians are being treated, not just by the Israelis, but by this government as well. So there's an opportunity now for this government to just do something. Just do something that's effective in providing some relief, comfort, succour and security to these desperate people. One of the actions we raised some months ago was the evacuation of injured children. I raised the question with the Deputy Foreign Secretary at the time. There were a number of voluntary organisations, both in here and Europe, that were willing to work together to secure access to health facilities, not just in Egypt, but beyond and into Europe itself and into Britain itself for those most injured. Now, we were assured at that time that a group was being formed, coordinated by the FCO, and that would enable this to happen. My understanding is that hasn't happened on any scale yet. And today we discover actually that the health service in Rafah has virtually collapsed because of the lack of fuel. There were 2 hospitals operating yesterday. I believe there's only 1 today. And the bombs are still dropping. The children are still being killed. Children are still being mutilated. And yet we provide no assistance in terms of allowing those children access to health facilities beyond Gaza itself. The least the government could do is ensure that there's an effective evacuation scheme for injured children. The least the government could do now is have a scheme, as exactly has been set out today, to enable people to gain at least some access to security. I don't know how much more we can take of this, to be honest, from this government, in terms of the distress our constituents feel, the anger at the inaction of the government, but beyond that, the complicity of the government supplying arms to the butchers who are maiming these children. So I just say to the Minister, listen to what's been said today on a cross-party basis. Listen to the individual cases. Listen to the suffering that's going on. And for God's sake, in the name of humanity, introduce a scheme that gives some comfort and succour and safety for these desperate people.
Yeah. We now come to the front bench contributions, and the guideline limits are 10 minutes for the SNP, 10 minutes for His Majesty's Opposition, 10 minutes for the Minister, and then Cat Smith will have 3 minutes at the end to sum up the debate. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Holloway. Somebody was asking me earlier on what a Westminster Hall debate is. And quite often in Westminster Hall, I told this person earlier on today, it's where everybody comes together to agree and to disagree with the Minister. And so it is proven today. Cross-party in this place, we have come together to agree that there must be a Gaza families reunion scheme, allowing people to come out of the hellish, unimaginable war zone of Gaza to get some safety with those that they love here in the UK. And people, in I think every street in my constituency have written to me on this. More than 3,000 people have written to me on the ongoing situation in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire, calling for the return of hostages, calling to allow aid to get in, and calling for a lasting peace and a two-state solution. This government has not done anything, really, anything practical to respond to these concerns being raised by all of our constituents. And I want to mention, in starting my contribution now, one particular constituent who came to see me in November. Now, Sama came to see me. She's been studying, working in Glasgow, and she is desperately, desperately afraid for her family. They were living in the north of Gaza. They have been moved, displaced now multiple times. She doesn't know how many times because she can't contact them. She can't hear from them. She doesn't know at any given time where they are and if they are safe. The last that I heard from her, they were in Rafah, which does not bode well for their ongoing safety, given what's going on. She wants her mother, her father, and her teenage brother to come to Scotland to be safe with her. That should not be too much to ask. I wrote to the Foreign Secretary and got the reply, as many others have done, the boilerplate reply, from not even from the Foreign Secretary, but from the Minister of State, Lord Ahmed, which did nothing to help my constituent. As my honourable friend from Glenrothes has said, it's difficult even to bear to give these constituents replies from this government because it does nothing to offer them any comfort whatsoever. I appealed to the aid agencies on the ground to ask in desperation if there's anything that they could even have done to help. They regretted that they could not, they did not have those powers. Now, Sama's father has a severe heart condition. He has high blood pressure, he has diabetes, he cannot get the medication that he needs. As the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington just spoke so eloquently about, there are no hospitals there that can help him either to get the treatment that he needs. The home that this family had built over 30 years lies in rubble and ruins. Sama showed me with pride pictures of what that house looked like the last time they were all together in it. Why is it that I have no answer that I can give to Sama to bring her family to safety? She knows that there is no safe and legal route. And other Palestinian constituents who are in touch also have no certainty. One applied for asylum back in December 2022 and is still waiting for a response. They're not going to send him back there, grant him the security he needs. Another gentleman has been in the UK for 18 years and has yet no certainty for his status. As Sama put it to me after one of my surgeries, she says, there's no money, there's no food, there's no ceasefire. There is no hope for those living in Gaza. Over 35,000 dead, 80,000 injured. And the Gaza Families Reunited campaign have brought a very, very reasonable request before the Minister here today. And I commend them for all the work that they have done on this. To talk something about the practicalities of what they are proposing here today. Now, honourable members across this chamber this afternoon have said that existing routes don't cut it, that they are not working. Family reunion, visitor visas, student visas, they are not working at all. Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. As you'll know, the Home Office only allows applications for family visas for immediate relatives, defined as partners, children or parents of children under 18. So that excludes other close relatives such as siblings or parents of adult children, for example. As a result, people with families in the UK, perhaps their only surviving relatives, might be stuck in Gaza with no way of joining them. So would she agree with me that it is beyond time that the UK government introduced a Palestinian family scheme, just as it did with the Ukrainian family scheme, and that in fact it has a historic colonial responsibility to do so?
I entirely agree with what she has presented, and the Gaza Families Reunited campaign have set out the eligibility, saying that eligibility would include an immediate family member, an extended family member, or an immediate family of an extended family member. And that's so important because we know that there are people who now have nobody left, that there are children who have been orphaned, who have not a soul in the world that they can rely upon, but they may have somebody here that they know is here, and they should be allowed to come to safety. It's cruelty beyond measure not to permit that to happen. Now, in the recent court case on this issue, where a recognised Palestinian refugee has won the case challenging the Home Office's refusal to decide the family entrance clearance applications of his wife and children under refugee family reunion rules on account of their inability to enrol their biometrics in Gaza. Now, this was described as being irrational and unreasonable by the courts. And it is entirely irrational and unreasonable. People are stuck, as the Honourable Member for Brighton Brazilian said, in a catch-22 where they need biometrics to be able to leave and they can't get the biometrics because they can't leave. It's impossible and illogical that this is the position. And it is in the government's hands to waive that requirement. Nobody else's hands. It is in this government, this minister's hand, to make that decision to waive that requirement for biometrics. He could do it at the stroke of a pen this afternoon if he so wished. And I would like an explanation from this minister for why he won't. Yeah. As yet, we have not had that explanation for why he won't. If it was good enough for people in Ukraine to get that biometric requirement waived, why is it not good enough for the people of Gaza, whose circumstances are absolutely grim? Now, people in Gaza are having to bribe their way across the border, being smuggled out, and they're supposed to be against people smuggling this government. But there is no choice for people. $5,000 per adult, $2,500 per child. If anybody can even scrape that money together, people are crowdfunding in the internet to pay themselves across the border. What kind of system is that? None whatsoever. And then, as the honourable members from Glenrothes and from Edinburgh South West mentioned, they get stuck somewhere else. They get stuck in Cairo waiting for something else to happen because this government won't move with the paperwork. It's absolutely ridiculous and it is cruel. When people could be here, could be safe, could be looked after, they are not. And what was also highlighted in that court case, it said that the disclosures were made in the course of that case that every single entry clearance visa application from Gaza made from the 7th of October has been refused by the Home Office. So if it is about safe and legal routes, why is it that they are automatically being refused? And we know from the past experience of this that even visitors' visas, a third of those last year were refused because they don't believe that people are going to go back to Gaza, and in the circumstances, why would you? But even if you could get a visitor visa, the government is quite likely to refuse it. The Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington mentioned people coming over in small boats, but given the very difficulty of even getting out of Gaza, that is not a prospect for most. And I note that the House of Commons Library briefing on this spoke of the rarity of this. It accounted for 0.14% of the people on boats. 53 out of 36,704. And they may well be sent to Rwanda after fleeing a war zone, getting across continents, getting in a small boat, getting to safety here. So could I have it from the Minister? Is anybody who came in such a way going to be removed to Rwanda? Will he at least rule that out for some kindness to these Gazans who have managed to make it to our shores to safety? Because again, it is just cruelty. The issue of people accessing medical treatment here was also raised by members, and the campaign Children Not Numbers have done a huge amount of work to evacuate people in the past, children whose medical needs are so absolutely dire. And we've all seen on our television screens at a remove the horror of children having amputations without anaesthetic, children whose lives have been devastated at such a young age. But they can't even get those children out now to do the medical treatment that they so desperately require for their own futures. Now, the Minister will come, I'm sure, as he always does, with how Britain is a welcoming country and we've done so much to resettle people and look at all these other things we've done in the past. What we're asking is for something now. It has been 6 months. He has had quite long enough to come to a conclusion on this. He has had quite long enough to design a scheme. The Gaza Families United campaign have given him the work on this. It's not going to be difficult for him to create such a scheme. It was done for the people of Ukraine much, much more swiftly than this. He is out of excuses. He needs to give the Gazan people some kind of certainty that they can come to safety. Otherwise, we will all know that this government does not care and it is prepared to ignore the people of Gaza. It is despicable.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Holbrook. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Lancaster and Fleetwood, for bringing forward this extremely important debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee and the 103,000 constituents across the country who signed the petition.
I'd also like to thank all of the honourable members here today for what I think has been an incredibly powerful and moving debate. And I think we've all been struck by how heavily subscribed the debate has been, and also the high degree of unanimity of views that have been expressed across the House. Mr. Hollowbone, the terrorist atrocities conducted by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 killed over 1,100 innocent civilians, included cases of rape and sexual violence, and of course the kidnapping of 250 people, the majority of whom have still not been released. It's almost impossible to comprehend the fear and anguish felt within those families that have been torn apart, and the unimaginable pain of the relatives of the hostages. Now, the Israeli government's response, as has been stated so clearly in this room today, and the subsequent war in Gaza has ended the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people, many of them women and children, and this continues to cause untold misery and heartache to hundreds of thousands more who have lost loved ones, who have had to flee for their lives. And now over 1 million people in Gaza face famine. At the heart of this conflict, we should never forget, are human beings who simply seek to live their lives free of violence and fear and intimidation, and who want nothing more than to protect their families and loved ones and build a successful future for them and their children. Therefore, the urgent imperative is to bring an end to this war, and we urge the government to use every ounce of its diplomatic leverage to create the conditions needed for an immediate ceasefire that is observed by both sides, with the immediate release of hostages and immediate unimpeded aid to Gaza. We have also been absolutely clear that the forced displacement of the Palestinian people is unacceptable, and the priority following an immediate ceasefire must be for Gazans to be able to return to their homes and to their land, to begin to rebuild all that they have lost during this devastating war, and to ensure that their displacement does not become permanent. This will be made exponentially harder by an Israeli offensive in Rafah, which risks catastrophic consequences, and therefore the Labour Party passionately opposes any intervention by the Israeli forces in Rafah. Indeed, the Shadow Foreign Secretary said in the Chamber on Tuesday of last week, the United States has said that an offensive in Rafah would be a disaster. The European Union has said that the world must prevent it, and the United Nations Security Council has called for an immediate ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu is ignoring the warnings of Israel's allies and partners, the United Kingdom included. The Rafah crossing is, of course, essential for moving humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and therefore the safety of those operating aid deliveries and of those receiving the aid must not be compromised. In tandem with that essential diplomatic work, and as the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues to worsen, the UK must consider the impact on British residents and citizens who have family in Gaza and are desperately seeking to ensure their safety. We have heard the indescribable anguish of British Palestinians regarding the fate of family members, including orphaned children who are trapped in Gaza, and their struggle to bring their relatives to safety. For instance, we know of one father who is here in the UK, desperately trying to reunite with his wife and 3 young children who are currently trapped in Gaza and sheltering in a house with over 200 other people. His twin babies are suffering with health issues, and his wife fears that she will run out of milk to feed them. And we've heard of the plight of an unaccompanied 14-year-old boy who is alone in Gaza, having lost both of his parents and been separated from wider family, who seeks to join his brothers in the UK who are British citizens. His brothers are settled and working in the UK and are desperate to have him join them. These are harrowing and horrific tales. At the moment, these families and others like them have been unable to leave Gaza. Even where they should qualify for family reunion under UK immigration rules, they are facing insurmountable barriers. For example, we've heard reports of long delays in getting decisions or visas issued, and families are also being told that they will not be given their visas, even though they are eligible until they have submitted biometrics data. However, there is no infrastructure left in Gaza at all, and it's completely impossible to get biometric data submitted from within Gaza itself. Although biometrics could be submitted from Egypt, the vast majority of these individuals and families are not able to travel to Egypt without some kind of visa or assistance from the UK. As a result, they're trapped. This is a desperate and deeply distressing scenario, and I'm therefore urging the Minister to look rapidly at the following issues. Will the Home Office now defer the biometrics requirements for those who are eligible for family reunion but cannot physically get out of Gaza until they can get to a visa application centre in Egypt or another country? Similar arrangements were rightly made for Ukrainians and could be replicated for Gaza now, as other countries like Canada, like the Canadian government, is already doing. So will the government now urgently operate a scheme whereby individuals in Gaza can have their family reunion visas assessed either online or by telephone, as is the case with the Canadian government, and approved in principle before being assisted to leave Gaza, with biometrics data then being submitted in Egypt prior to travel to the UK? Second, will the FCDO work urgently to ensure that all those who hold UK visas are eligible for family reunion but must leave Gaza in order to submit biometrics, that they are assisted to leave? What cooperation has there been with Egypt on this issue, and how will this be managed if the Rafah crossing closes altogether? Will the Home Office and FCDO look urgently at wider obstacles to family reunion for the family members of British citizens and residents who are trapped in Gaza, and what more could be done to help British Palestinians get their relatives to safety? British Palestinians have made clear that their families who do come here will want to return home to Gaza as soon as it is safe to do so. So, of course, right of return must be built into the process. So, in conclusion, Mr. Vickers, in addition to making the family visa scheme operational...
I was just waiting to hear, just very briefly, given that the Prime Minister only has to give a month's notice for a general election, and we're expecting the Labour Party will be in power. I was just waiting to hear. I'm assuming that the answer to all those questions, if the Labour Party get into power, would be yes, but I just want to hear him say that. Give us some reassurance.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and yes, what we are saying is that there is a family visa scheme that exists, but it is not operational. So we have to make it operational, and we are proposing the method of the in-principle assessments followed by assistance, so that you can then have the biometric tests in a visa application centre. The UK government must continue to push for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages, immediate unimpeded aid to Gaza, and work towards a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowburn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hollowburn. And it is, of course, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I think it is fair to say that all of us in this House are deeply concerned and moved by events in the Middle East. The barbaric attack perpetrated on October the 7th by Hamas was an affront to humanity. At the same time, as we condemn Hamas, lament the loss of life they inflicted, and demand the release of the hostages, we're also united in our horror at the civilian casualties and the scale of the suffering in Gaza. Israel has a right, indeed a responsibility, to defend itself against the threat from terrorists. As we've made clear repeatedly, it is important that it does so in accordance with international humanitarian law. I reiterate that point today. Members will be aware that the government has mounted and continues to mount a large-scale effort to facilitate the flow of aid which is so desperately needed. As the Deputy Foreign Secretary said in the House less than a week ago, we want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible, and the fastest way to end the conflict is to secure a deal that gets the hostages out and allows for a pause in the fighting in Gaza. We must then turn that pause into a sustainable, permanent ceasefire. Regarding the situation in Rafah, our position has been consistent. We're deeply concerned about the prospect of a military incursion, given the number of civilians who are sheltering there and the importance of that entry point for aid. Entry points for humanitarian aid, including Kerem Shalom, must be reopened quickly to allow aid in. Israel must facilitate immediate, uninterrupted humanitarian access in the south, especially the entry of fuel, and ensure the protection of civilians and safe passage for those who wish to leave Rafah. As yet, we've not seen a credible plan to protect civilians. In parallel, we continue to push as hard as we can to get much-needed aid into Gaza via vital land routes, alongside sea and air, to alleviate suffering. Israel has now committed to significant steps to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza, and I'll gladly give way to him.
Giving way, and he's outlined the many threats and dangers that innocent civilians in Rafah are facing. Does he not accept that he's actually making the case for the government to introduce a Gaza family visa scheme?
Yeah, well said.
Well, I will come on to address various points that have been made during the course of the debate today, and to answer various questions that have been asked, which speak to the position that the government takes in relation to this issue. But it is, of course, the case that we continue to keep under close review the arrangements that we have in place, as you would expect, and the various wider points that are pertinent to colleagues in the Foreign Office. I will also ensure are raised directly with them following this debate, because I think it is important that the points that the House has made that are directly relevant to Foreign Office colleagues and their diplomatic engagement with leaders overseas, as well as with the Israeli government and others, are properly heard. I'll gladly give way to the Honourable Lady.
He's very generous at giving way Would he accept that, given that the estimates from charities are that there are 17,000 orphans, that we are dealing with a situation which is really extreme, and that therefore there should be some kind of special scheme in this regard, given our special historic link with the region and with this particular conflict?
Well, one of the points that I was particularly struck by during various remarks during the course of the debate was particularly around this issue of admitting children to UK hospitals in order to be able to access treatment and support. What I can say about that is that presently we haven't received any specific applications, but we understand that NGOs such as the International Organisation of the Red Cross are able to support those requiring urgent medical treatment out of Gaza, and likewise Children Not Numbers also supports children of Gaza to secure evacuation from Gaza and to deliver aid to families. What I would say is that if applications come forward, they will be treated with the utmost seriousness in the way that I think the House would want to see, and I undertake to give very careful consideration to any applications that come forward in that regard, for the very reasons. I'll gladly give way to the Father of the House.
Grateful. In one of the government responses to a petition, they said applications could be made through Egypt, Jordan or Turkey. Are we to understand from the Minister that there may be a way of making applications without having to go from Gaza to Egypt, Jordan or Turkey?
If I may, I want to come to this point in full later in my remarks, because there's various related aspects to that point that I think it is important to fully address, because these arrangements are important and I know that they're of real interest to colleagues. Just to finish on the wider point that I was making that's important contextually, we do now need to see all of the various points that I was able to raise in those introductory remarks turned into action to ensure that aid actually gets over the border and that it is safely and properly distributed. And we look to Israel to meet its commitments to flood Gaza with aid. Turning now to the real substance of the debate, I will give way to, I'm conscious there's quite a lot to get through, but I'll gladly give way to it.
Food on the border is of no aid to those that are starving, and medicine on the border cannot heal those that need it. And not being able to guarantee the safety of civilians is essentially the reason why we need this scheme urgently.
I would argue that the principal, most important thing is to have a durable ceasefire that brings an end to the hostilities and that is durable in the long term, because that is the best outcome for the region. It is the best outcome for everybody in the region. But the House will recognise why that is impossible with Hamas in charge in Gaza. And we continue as a government to make these arguments, and we will continue to make the argument that it is imperative that that aid is able to flow in order to be able to properly support people. So turning to the substance of the debate today, it is the case that we are assisting British nationals and other eligible people to leave Gaza, liaising closely with the Israeli and Egyptian authorities. However, we do not control the Rafah border crossing, and it is the Israeli and Egyptian authorities who make the final decisions on who can exit Gaza. We are aware of the unique circumstances affecting those who would like to exit Gaza and the unusual role of foreign governments in seeking permission to leave on behalf of individuals. The FCDO has, therefore, been able to facilitate the departure from Gaza to Egypt of Palestinians who have both strong links to the UK by having either a spouse or children under 18 currently living in the UK and currently hold valid permission to enter or remain for longer than 6 months. I'll gladly take another intervention, then I must make some progress.
Grateful for the Minister for giving way. I'm listening carefully to what he's saying. The fact is there is no safe and legal route for Palestinians to come to the UK, and not only is he refusing to set up a Palestinian family scheme, as every member in this debate has called on him to, and as the government did with Ukraine, but because of his government's Rwanda law, any Palestinians who come by small boat, because they have no other means of getting here, will be criminalised and deported. Does he not regret even a little bit voting for that law?
What I would say to her is that no member, honourable member or right honourable member, I would argue, should in any way give credence to the business model of what are evil people smuggling gangs who are, frankly, taking people's money, sending people to sea in unseaworthy vessels and having no regard whatsoever for the lives of those individuals. That is terrible criminality responsible for those crossings, and all of those crossings.
The lady has had her intervention and the Minister is responding to it. The Honourable Lady might not like the answer, but we can't have shouting across the chamber or the debate will come disorderly. Minister.
But it is a fact that all of those individuals who are leaving French shores in small boats are leaving what are fundamentally safe countries. There is no justifiable reason for anybody to be making that perilous crossing and putting their life at risk in the way that we have seen, with catastrophic consequences yet again only within the last fortnight, with that young girl losing her life in the most appalling of circumstances. That is evil criminality responsible for that, and we must be very careful in everything that we say and do to ensure that the evil individuals responsible for that criminality are not able to encourage people to make those crossings. That is a very important point that I would make. And to go back to the point that I was making, as I say, decisions as to who can leave Gaza and enter Egypt remain with the Israeli and Egyptian authorities. And we will obviously keep the position under review, as I've said. But there are a couple of challenges that we have to be mindful of in the context of what we are dealing with. First, there are those practical reasons, the challenges that are apparent in terms of being able to get people out. And secondly, the need to maintain biometric checks in order to protect people here in the United Kingdom. I think that the House will recognise that the security relationship, for example, with the Ukrainian authorities, is a very different security relationship to that which we have with the authorities in Gaza, who are a terrorist organisation. And I've referred to this previously in various other debates in the House. And it is an important distinction that has to be made about the security cooperation that we had in the context of that immediate evacuation of Ukraine, of vulnerable people, via that safe and legal route. We have subsequently reintroduced the biometric checks requirement. But in the immediate circumstances that we were presented with, it was important, the security relationship, that dynamic, that was able to help us to be able to make those changes in response to that very specific crisis. And I will say a little bit more about those challenges because I think that they are materially important. Firstly, on this issue of enrolling biometrics, setting up a route would not address the wider challenges that are faced with people unable to exit Gaza. To complete the application process by submitting biometrics, and any change to the biometric requirements would cause critical identity and security checks to not be completed, which could expose the UK public to heightened levels of harm. Regardless of this, it would not address the fact that it is the Israeli and Egyptian government who make decisions on who can exit Gaza and enter Egypt. There is a very strong basis for why biometric checks are vital. As I say, they are critical to ensuring identity assurance and suitability checks on foreign nationals who are subject to immigration control. Checks are made against immigration and criminality records. We have a duty to uphold national security, I would argue, as a government, and to guard against public safety risks. What I'm not going to do, there have been various references today to what is ongoing litigation. The House will understand why it is not appropriate for me to comment on ongoing litigation. I'll gladly give way to him.
For giving way. As I said in my own speech, nobody's arguing that there shouldn't be biometric checks, but you can do them at an intermediate country such as Egypt. Yeah. The Canadians operate like that, and the Canadians also are much more successful then on getting people out of the country because they're on a specific list. Why can't the UK government just do what the Canadians are doing?
Hear, hear, hear.
Of course, there would have to be agreement around that, but he specifically raised the issue of deferral during the course of his remarks. What I can say on that is that we have agreed to predetermine a small number of cases in line with published guidance. We will predetermine an application where a person confirms they're able to travel to a visa application centre. They can satisfy us about their identity, and there are compelling reasons for doing so in the way that I've described. There was also reference to fee waiver applications during the course of the debate. People need to apply for a visa by filling in the form and contacting UKVI. Then the compassionate element to predetermine or waive fees will be considered. And on the point about wider relatives, which again I know was of interest in a number of the contributions that we heard today, under the adult dependent relatives rules, an applicant must show that as a result of age, illness or disability, they require long-term personal care to perform everyday tasks, and that this can solely be provided in the UK by their relative here. If this is not met, however, a decision maker will consider if there are compelling, compassionate and exceptional circumstances to grant leave outside the rules. Specifically on visa application centres, although UKVI have a visa application centre in Gaza, I recognise that it has been closed since the 7th of October due to the conflict. Therefore, those who exit Gaza into Egypt can access UK visa application centres in either Cairo or Alexandria. Both locations have good appointment availability, with Cairo having 43% of capacity remaining for the week commencing the 12th of May, and 76% in the week commencing the 19th of May, and Alexandria 74% and 93%, respectively. In the event that a person... I'll gladly give way to him.
Statistics are very interesting, but we're here to talk about people. Will the Minister accept my invitation to meet with my constituent and the constituent of my learned and honourable friend so that he can explain directly to them why he won't allow them to look after their mum?
I would refer him actually to the point that I made a little earlier on, and it may well be that he wishes to encourage his constituent to make an application reflecting on that point that I was just able to set out in response very directly to the points that he made in his remarks, and which I think is relevant in cases such as that which he describes. But he knows, and his colleagues know. I'll gladly give way to it.
Very grateful to him for giving way. My honourable friend, the member for Glenrothes, mentioned that we have constituents who are sisters who have an elderly mother that we've both spoken about, and asked if the Minister would be prepared to meet them. Would the Minister be prepared to meet them? And if so, will he be prepared to give them an estimate of the likelihood of the kind of application he's talking about being successful?
I think she will appreciate. I didn't have the opportunity to finish the point that I was making, but she will appreciate why I am not in a position to be able to give authoritative immigration advice on individual cases. But what I can refer colleagues to is the points that I've made and the various routings that people may wish to explore in order to take their cases forward. I would be very happy, I think she knows actually from previous dealings that we've had, and her colleagues likewise, that I'm always very happy to engage with colleagues in the House about issues and concerns relevant to their constituents. That is absolutely no different in this particular circumstances, and I'll very gladly meet with both honourable members to talk about this matter. I'll gladly give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Can I just take him back to the issue of children? In January, I tabled an early day motion asking the government to meet with and support the organisation Saving Gaza's Children. I was assured by the Deputy Foreign Minister at the time, on the floor of the House, that that organisation would be linked to the FCO's group that was working to facilitate the evacuation of children on medical grounds. The Minister has said today there's been no applications whatsoever. So clearly the system that was established by the Foreign Office is not working. And the information that we have at the moment is that the European hospital, which was functioning, is now run out of fuel and is in blackout. The Kuwaiti hospital in Rafah has received orders from the Israeli military to evacuate this morning. And the Hilal al-Mirati hospital has stopped admitting patients over the last few days. The health service is in crisis. Children are being maimed. Children are being injured. Yet the Minister has said today the system that we were promised some months ago is not operational.
I will want to go and pick up that specific point with colleagues in the Foreign Office and understand the specifics around it. But I would refer him to the point that I made at the very outset of my remarks in relation to those very vulnerable children. I am more than happy to engage with him on this particular point, and I would equally be very willing to engage with the charity that he references in relation to this specific point, so that we can fully understand the circumstances, fully understand the needs. But the position, as I understand it, as I'm advised presently by officials, is as per that which I set out earlier. But we will most definitely pick up that engagement with him and with the charity. I'll gladly give way to him.
James Murray. Thank the Minister for giving way. And further to his comments earlier about visa application centres, as you may recall, I've been writing to him about the parents of a constituent of mine, Maisara, who's a British citizen whose parents had visas to visit the UK last autumn. Now, those visas have now expired. And when I've been asking the Minister what my constituent's parents should do, he said they should reapply by visiting the nearest accessible visa application centre to submit their biometrics. But as many members here today, and indeed the Minister himself has acknowledged, there are no functioning visa application centres in Gaza. So can the Minister please explain to my constituent what exactly should his parents do?
What I'm not going to do is again, to casework specific individual cases on the floor of the House this evening. The point that I was able to make around deferral may be something that he wishes to explore with his constituents. I will.
The Minister will be aware that there was recently a court challenge which ruled that the government's policy on biometric deferrals was unlawful, and the Home Office has been forced to issue new interim unsafe journey guidance for cases where someone is unable to travel safely to a visa application centre. So I was just wondering when the government's planning to publish that new revised unsafe journey guidance.
I'm afraid to have to say to him that I am not in a position, as he will appreciate, given the position that he holds as a shadow minister, the position with regard to ongoing litigation. I'm not in a position to be able to do that today. And there were various points raised as well around processing times. if part of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office cohort, they are prioritised and compassionate cases are expedited. FCDO cases currently processed within 5 working days from VAX, and we continue to work intensively with FCDO colleagues to support individuals to leave. There were also a number of points raised around the wider safe and legal routes landscape. I am actually very proud that as a country we have provided over 500,000 people sanctuary in the UK since 2015. The point was specifically raised by the Honourable and Learned Lady who represents an Edinburgh constituency around the commitments that we made in relation to the cap as part of the Illegal Migration Act. What I can say to her, I can be very specific about this, is that the work is on track to take that forward, that I expect to be able to publish the figure, and I expect to be able to lay the statutory instrument to deliver that cap for 2025 ahead of the summer recess. And my message would be,
Order. Right. The Minister is perfectly entitled to take the intervention, but I'll just gently remind the Minister that he must resume his seat because Cat Smith has to sum up the debate no later than 7:27. Joanna Cherry.
Mr Hollowbone, my question wasn't about the cap. My question was about when are the government going to introduce safe and legal routes that they promised during the passage of the Illegal Migration Act. That's what I was asking about, not about the cap.
Commitment in and what the law requires is for the government to come forward with the figure around the cap, and that is precisely what we will do, which will set out the places that we are able to provide for people to be able to come, working particularly in partnership with the UNHCR, through a safe and legal route to the United Kingdom in 2025. I think that is a very welcome thing, and I would most definitely encourage areas to come forward if they haven't provided a figure for this year. I would encourage them to come forward with offers of support in future years, because we want to see that generosity grow year on year to respond to international crises around the world. Just finally, Mr Hollowbone, ultimately we need a long-term solution to this crisis. This means the release of all hostages, Hamas's rule dismantled, their ability to attack Israel removed, a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, and a political horizon to a two-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians should be able to live together side by side in peace and security. That ultimately is our goal, and we will continue working tirelessly to achieve it.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr Hollowbone. When members of the public go on the e-petitions website and start a petition, it can be a quite intimidating experience because the thresholds to get a government response at 10,000 signatures and to hit over 100,000 signatures to secure this kind of debate are so high. But these petitioners have met that relatively easily, and I think that shows the strength of feeling within all of our constituencies about how people feel about this situation. And to be very direct to the Minister, I think they'll be incredibly disappointed with his response this afternoon, because what they were asking was, how can it be that Palestinians have no safe routes to the UK when they have family here? And the Minister has said a lot of words, but frankly I think that members of the public watching will be thinking that they made very little sense. I think particularly his comments about there being a good availability of appointments in Cairo will have probably left people shouting at their TV screens that they're watching this on, because people can't get to Cairo from Gaza. They are trapped, and that is why they have started this petition for a Palestinian and Gaza-specific scheme similar to Ukraine. I'd like to thank all colleagues for taking part in this debate, and it's been actually really comforting to see the cross-party consensus and the way in which we all spoke with one voice supporting this scheme. And I think it's incredibly disappointing that the Government Minister today has really not followed suit with the rest of the mood in this room. And I think that the comments particularly around orphan children will be staying with me for a very, very long time. Because those children have absolutely nobody in this world, but they might have a distant relative. It might be an aunt or an uncle here in the UK, but they're not therefore qualifying for any UK visa scheme. And I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Hayes and Harlington for the points he's made about those children who have been injured very, very severely. And I do urge the Minister to keep his word and to follow up with my honourable friend on that particular issue, because although it's not specifically about the visa scheme, I think that that is something which the UK could do to really try and foster more positive relations with Palestinians who right now will be looking at what this government minister has said and feeling incredibly let down and disappointed. But I'd like to finally just thank everyone for coming in and taking part in this debate. It's possibly been the best attended petitions debate that I've had the privilege of introducing. And I know that it takes 3 hours is a lot of time to commit as a Member of Parliament, but I'm sure that's because of the passion that we all feel and the over 100,000 people who signed this petition.
Well said.
This House has considered e-petition 648577 relating to a visa scheme for Palestinians. As many as with that opinion say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.